The webway. 745.M32. Geller field breached. Called out an officer. Etheric surge in Deck 3, Section 5-6. Crew reporting minor manifestations. Sylviana. Shouted Elidios over the din of alarms blaring on the bridge of the Judgment's Will. I'm on it. She replied, already rushing toward the doors, a squad of tempestuous signs moving in behind her. Unlike Elidios and all of the ship's troops, Inquisitor Sylviana hadn't put on armor, for she didn't need to. After her near death at the destruction of the Azeroth Conclave by the Chaos Sorcerer Arsum and his pet Xenos Witch, her entire body had been remade. At over 2 meters high, she towered over all others in the room, a humanoid construct of augmetics and weaponry that, according to the tech priests who had rebuilt her, could conceivably take on a dreadnought and emerge victorious. She had used that strength many times in the past few days. The path to nightmares, as their Eldar allies called this section of the webway, had been breached by demons centuries ago. It was now little different from the warp, and the horrors that dwelled there hungered for the souls of those who dared to enter their conquered domain. It was difficult to gauge a Xeno's emotions, but the Inquisitor Lord was certain the Mayan Tor elders had been terrified when they had reached the great webway gate whose position Elethria had leaned in the Archive of Los. Every sailor in the Imperial Navy feared the warp, but the elders dreaded the Immaterium far more, to the point their ships never used it, relying entirely on the crumbling webway network, supplemented by the gates they could create themselves, much smaller echoes of the great portals their forebears had erected all across the galaxy in the age of their empire. Elidios could see why they were so afraid. The Eldar ships were under at least twice as much pressure as their Imperial counterparts, the infernal hordes drawn to the bright souls of the Xenos. Not that the Imperial ships had an easy time, of course, far from it. Every single ship in the Allied fleet had been under almost constant attack since they had crossed the webway gate. After their victory in the Archive, the Inquisitors and Farseer had recovered the soul stones that had been embedded in Tarek's arm. No other trace of their companion had remained. They had been sent to Mayan Tor to be studied by the Elders, before a decision was made as to whether to add them to the Craftworld's Infinity Circuit or not. With the soul stones recovered, they had begun making their way back to the surface. There, they had found that the Forsaken Sons had fled, their retreat from the system starting right at the moment Tarek had sacrificed himself to kill Mikhail Kushenenko. The battle in the void had been contested enough that they had been able to withdraw with minimal casualties, with a handful of lesser ships sacrificed as a rear guard while their masters escaped. With the departure of the sorcerer who had summoned them, the spectral orcs that had kept the allied forces at bay had vanished, and the trio had emerged into the light of day to find Autarch Irithialatz and Chapter Master Aguilalistors waiting for them, their troops trading dirty looks behind them. The Farseer had left with her kindred, while Elidios and Alphon returned to the Judgment's Will. Alphon had disposed of the still-living head of the hunter the warp had sent after Tarek, securing it inside a stasis field further reinforced by blessings laid down by priests of the Ecclesiarchy. Later, when there was more time, maybe they would throw it into a star, once it had been properly studied and it was certain such would not free the entity to return, as demons were wont to do. Their final reinforcements had arrived at Neril soon after, as the last transports returned from the surface. The Fire of Dawn had only exchanged sporadic communication with the rest of the fleet. As far as the other Imperials were concerned, the battle barge was another group of Astartes added to their forces before the final battle. What the Elders knew, Elidios could only guess. The Allied fleet had ventured deep into the graveyard, that subsector laid to waste by the War of the Beast. They had passed beyond the dead systems and into one that had been plagued by ill omens and warp phenomena long before the rise of the Beast, the reason for that reputation revealed as the Elders brought them to an abandoned webway gate floating in the void of space. Unlike the other gates, the Elders had reluctantly led their Imperial allies through in order to catch the Forsaken Sons in time. This one led to a section of the webway that had long since been overrun with demons. Elidios hadn't even known such was possible, but apparently it was, though extracting details from the Elders was like pulling teeth. There was no doubt, however, that the Forsaken Sons fleet had passed through the gate. Navigators and psychers both could feel the spore of their corrupted ships lingering in the ether. And so, with no other choice, the Imperial ships had raised their Geller fields and plunged through the gate. Eldar ships lacked such protections, however. To them, traveling through the warp was absurdly dangerous, and their knowledge of the webway made it redundant. Now, They were forced to stay as close to the Imperial ships as possible, remaining within the envelopes of their Geller fields with their own shields raised and weapons at the ready. It made an already difficult journey even more taxing for the crews, but the Inquisitor Lord knew they would need every ally they could get when they reached the anchor of Vul. After all, none other than the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights had confirmed it to him. The Judgment's Will was small by the standards of Imperial ships. In truth, it was hardly suited to serve as the flagship of the Inquisitor Lord. But it had been Ickerman's ship long before his ascension to the rank of leader of the Shattered Isarok Conclave, and Ickerman had insisted on remaining aboard it. Having seen some of the repositories and facilities Ickerman had built inside, Alphon could understand why. Yet despite its comparatively small size, the frigate still held thousands of souls within its hull, and all of them were at risk. Many had already died, some of them by Alphon's own hand as they succumbed to demonic corruption. The rest lived under siege, moving only in groups and with armed protection, ready to send word to their masters the moment they detected anything untoward. It had caused a number of false alarms, as tempers grew frayed the longer this state of constant vigilance went on, and terrible nightmares spawned from the well of existential horror the Nightmare Fleet had once inspired across scores of inhabited worlds haunted every moment of sleep. But it was the most efficient way to do it, which Alphon found disturbingly similar to how the Imperium operated on a greater scale with its billion worlds, each adrift and alone in the night. Purging teams moved in response to calls for help, going wherever the greatest threats were, which was why Alphon was threading through knee-high sludge and firing repeatedly at a creature that looked like someone had taken a big canine, put its organs on the outside, and jammed a horn made of human bone in its skull. It, and others like it, had slaughtered an entire battery crew before fleeing into this section of the ship, where liquid waste was recycled. If they weren't destroyed, they would taint the water supply of the frigate, which would put further pressure on the crew as rations were cut to avoid further contamination. Of course, the waste would still need additional purification anyway, due to having been walked into by a pack of demons that had also died in it. As always, the choice was between doing something with negative consequences and doing nothing, which would have worse ones in the long run. Captain Tyrion fought alongside Alphon. Despite the wounds he had sustained at Silberstadt, the air of Sanguinius was still more than a match for the inquisitorial troopers who battled the demons manifesting across the ship, and Alphon would have needed to shoot him to keep him from joining the fray. In truth, his assistance was welcome. In the dim illumination of emergency lumens, Tyrion's ebony skin and silver and red armor gave him a sinister aspect, making him look like the fury of the Emperor rendered into flesh and ceramite despite their surroundings. The Inquisitor and the Space Marine fought at the front of their purging squad, supported by the fire of a dozen stormtroopers in the back. Despite their training, the men and women had been somewhat awed by their assigned officers, and, to Alphon's surprise, it hadn't been just Tyrion who had provoked that reaction. Stories of his return aboard the ship carrying the decapitated, still living head of a Chaos Marine had spread among the crew. That was worrying, for Alphon had many secrets that drawing attention risked exposing. It was why, even as an Inquisitor, he had tried to stay in the background, and had pushed Ickerman to assume a leadership role partly to keep attention away from him. At least the journey through the contaminated section of the webway had given people plenty of other things to occupy their thoughts. Despite his extensive knowledge of the galaxy, Alphon didn't know how the webway worked. No one did, really, not even the elders despite the use they made of it, or how it could become infested with demons. It was probably something to do with the Eye of Terror, and the many entrances to the webway that had existed there before the fall. The dog thing recoiled from the impact of his bolt shells, then died when he plunged his sword through its repugnant skull. He moved past it, feeling a brief flash of heat as one of the stormtroopers incinerated the dissolving corpse with a short-range flamer meant for close-quarter encounters and disposal. If he hadn't been wearing his freshly repaired power armor, the heat would have burned his skin to at least the 3rd degree. More of the beasts came, unfazed by the fate of their companion. These were bestial things, lacking the intellect the higher servants of the ruinous powers displayed. They were nightmares given awful reality by the stuff of the warp, unleashed upon the materium to feed the monstrous hungers of false gods. Alphon despised them with all his heart, though he didn't let that hatred affect his thoughts and actions. He kept fighting, and they kept coming, until one of them managed to bite his left wrist. Its teeth should have shattered against his armor, made as they were of brittle bone, but instead they pierced through the metal, driven by unholy anima. He grimaced under his helmet as he felt the teeth pierce his skin, pain and a far more revolting sense of defilement washing over his senses. Then the dog thing leapt back, howling in pain, its jaws aflame. Its skull burst apart from a well-aimed lance shot from behind Alphon. Holding his wounded arm close, the Inquisitor briefly glanced at Tyrion, then at the stormtroopers. No one was saying anything. They had all seen far stranger things during this campaign. Yet perhaps it was time to start thinking about moving again, once this war was done and the Forsaken Sons were dealt with. The galaxy was vast, and there were a lot of places in the Imperium where he could put his skills to good use. It would be far from the first time he had to do this, nor would it be the last. That tended to happen when you outlived everyone around you. Iridiel ripped his sword out of the throat of a pale-skinned thing spawned by his ancestors' debauchery, severing its head before plunging the blade through the eye of another in one smooth motion. The bridge had been breached again. There had been no respite since they had entered this benighted section of the webway, only brief instants between battles. Already scores of Eldar souls had been lost, their spirit stones cracked and their essences drawn into the maw of She Who Thirsts. His Void Stalker-class battleship, the Promise of Lilith, was the greatest vessel in Mayan Tor's fleet. Its crew numbered in the thousands, and almost all of them had needed to fight. He had been directing the defense of his ship from the bridge without cease, as well as giving advice to the other Eldar ships in the combined fleet. How the Monkey could possibly rely on their so-called Gillerfields to sail the Sea of Souls, he had no idea. He knew that their journeys weren't usually as dangerous. The nature of this place and the attraction of Eldar souls definitely played a part in their current circumstances. But he was still convinced it was only sheer numbers that let their empire function despite the horrible danger of their method of faster-than-light travel, just as it was sheer stupidity that let the species continue to use that method in the first place. What manner of deluded lunatic thought ripping a hole through the fabric of the universe in order to physically enter a dimension populated by demons was a good idea? In this case, however, the Monkey's lunacy was serving their cause, though it was of course also the reason they were in this whole mess in the first place. Without the protection of their Geller fields, however flawed, the Elders would have been annihilated long ago, their entire fleet condemned to a fate infinitely worse than death. The fields kept most of the Neverborn at bay, though the sight of thousands of the youngest goddess children burning themselves to dissolution against them so that a handful could pass through would remain in his memories until his death. The Autarch hoped their quarry was equally beset, but he doubted it. The Forsaken Sons had proved that there was no depth to which they wouldn't sink, and it was all too likely they had some mean of ensuring their passage was free of attack by the Neverborn. They were, after all, servants of the dark powers who had created these horrors. Another demonet launched itself as Iridiel. It was taller than the ones he had already slain. It held a long blade that seemed made of a single piece of glass in its six-fingered hand, the weapon deceptively fragile. "Beloved child," it purred, with a voice as smooth as the finest silk. "The Dark Prince is waiting for you. Such delights we have prepared." It struck with its weapon. Iridiel pushed it aside with his own sword, before firing directly into the demonet's skull with his pistol. It moaned as it fell to the bridge's floor, moaning in pleasure mixed with pain. Its sword slipped from its grasp and shattered into 1,000 pieces with a discordant sound that made Iridiel grit his teeth in pain. "Why do you resist us, beloved child?" it whispered as it dissolved. "We bring you everything you desire. Everything you ever dreamt of." The Autarch didn't answer it. Engaging the spawn of She Who Thirsts in conversation was always a mistake. Iridiel was under no illusion as to the fate that awaited his soul should he perish here. Yet, for a brief moment, his thoughts turned back to the Shaialat they had faced on Neril, and the notion formed in his mind that maybe, to what passed for the sentience of She Who Thirsts and her children, the eternal torments they inflicted upon the Eldar souls in their keeping was something to be grateful for. Had the youngest goddess not been created by the excesses of the ancient elders, as they sought new and ever stronger sensations? The agonies of the Silver Palace certainly were all that and more. He banished the thought before its implications could sink in, aware that only madness and damnation awaited that way. Elethria sat cross-legged in her chamber. Her room lay deep inside the ship and was heavily guarded, for her soul shone even brighter than that of the other children of Aisha to the hungry eyes of the demons. Her eyes were closed, all of her focus turned inward as she sought to perceive the web of possible futures stretching out ahead of them. It was all but impossible. Since the eruption of the Mardala, that which the Imperium called the Wailing Storm, the Farseers had been severely limited, to the point the path had been all but abandoned by the time Tarek had ended up on Mayan Tor. Things were even worse now, but there was value in identifying the reasons for that near blindness if nothing else. As far as Elethria could tell, there were two reasons for the increase in difficulty of farseeing. The first was the nexus of corruption and dark power that led the Forsaken Sons, the Chaos Lord Archon. His existence was like a tumor in the skein, infecting viable futures and drowning them in madness and ruin. The shadow he cast over the future of this region of the galaxy was dark indeed, and what few details she could glimpse in that darkness horrified her. If the Rioway Noah was unleashed, Mayan Tor would fall, there was no doubt about it. The craft world would be torn apart, and the only survivors would be those who managed to flee through the webway and claim sanctuary among other Eldar enclaves, whose number was ever diminishing. However, it was the second reason that worried her now. The Forsaken Sons, for all their evil, were a known quantity by that point, though why they thought they could possibly control the Rioway Noah was beyond her ability to understand. But it had been when the Imperials had met up with their latest reinforcements, a single, massive ship, bristling with weaponry and wards that kept her from scrying its contents, that her farsight had almost completely left her. There was one being aboard that ship, or possibly several, with the kind of power that bent fate itself around it, twisting the future in ways that made it impossible to predict. It terrified her. Archon's power came from the dark gods he served, but the warriors aboard that ship most definitely had nothing to do with the ruinous powers. In fact, she was certain they had been created specifically to fight them. The demons that attacked the rest of the Allied fleet were reluctant to approach their ship. It hadn't been attacked at all, and the ships nearest to it had barely been troubled as well. The notion that the Imperium still had beings of such might in its ranks after the end of their heresy and the disappearance of their semi-mythical primarchs was disquieting to say the least. It implied that the monarchy could somehow create such beings, though the process must obviously be so costly even their bloated empire couldn't afford to raise entire armies of them, otherwise they would have crushed the primordial annihilator long ago. She could only perceive glimpses of what lurked behind the psychic wards, but what she got wasn't reassuring. The blood of innocence, the destruction of individuality, the scourging of all memories, leaving naught but service to a distant and silent god that sat on his throne and... She jerked awake, dragged out of her meditation by the merest glimpse of the God Emperor's power that dwelled aboard the mysterious ship. Her heart was beating at speeds that were unhealthy even to a child of Aisha. It took her several minutes to calm down, and even then, her mind recoiled every time she thought back to what she had glimpsed. Elethria was aware of the tensions that existed between her people and the Imperium. Tarek had managed to bring them together by pointing out the horror that would follow failure, but he was dead now, and the Battle of Neril had hardly endeared the elders of Mayan Tor and the monarchy to each other. She didn't think things would come to blows while the threat of the Rioway Noah remained, but after that, she started to plan. Petronicus took a deep breath, savoring the burn as his 3 lungs were filled with various pathogens that immediately started trying to kill him. They stood no chance of success, but their futile efforts would spawn new, delightful contagions inside his flesh. When the journey through the webway had started, the nameless transport, a refitted cargo hauler taken as spoils during one of the many conquests of the Wailing Storm, had been packed full with over 20,000 cultists, beastmen, and other bolter fodder. Those had been the very dregs of the hordes that had been gathered by the Warband for the Black Crusade, the ones young Malone hadn't been able to find a use for in his holding campaign on Beranos. They could have made a nice distraction on one of the worlds of the Azarok sectors, but Archon had decided otherwise. Instead, they had all been dragged into the cargo hauler, and Petronicus and the rest of his Nurglite brethren had been set to work making something useful out of them, using the latest plague samples Teofarad had given them when they had returned to Paraxis. Decades of research had allowed the Reborn to perfect his formula, and this new version of the zombie plague that had laid waste to the hive city of Talixorn was much more efficient. Rather than create hordes of mindless zombies with a handful of plagueborn to direct them, this one was supposed to turn nearly every infected into poxwalkers, which would retain their sentience and ability to use weapons while being blessed with Nurgle's resilience of body and will. Archon thought this would be a significant upgrade to the quality of the troops. Having spent days in the transport, Petronicus agreed with him. The first step had been to make sure the bridge was sufficiently sealed and supplied with everything the few essential crew would need to successfully sail the transport to its destination. There was no time to transform the entire ship into a proper plague ship, not with the Imperials on their trail. Once that was done, Petronicus and his 41 plague marines, half the initial number of Death Guards who had survived the exodus from Terra, attrition having taken its toll even with the Nurgle-given endurance they enjoyed, had spread across the ship and gotten to work. Food, water and air had all been spiked with the plague. Combined with the cramped conditions and lack of hygiene of the wretches, the sickness had spread obscenely quickly. The vast hangars where they had set camps were filled with the wails of the dying and the stench of rotting, still living flesh. Attempts made by valiant souls to quarantine the sick and burn the corpses of those who succumbed to the disease were met with violence. The plague marines broke their legs and left them alive for the plague to take. Ironically, Petronicus and his brothers spent much of the journey aiding the sick, bringing them tainted food and water so that they wouldn't die before the transformation was complete. Thousands still perished, their corpses becoming breeding grounds for hordes of vermin and new forms of sickness. The conversion rate was less than what had been reached in Talik Sorn, where nigh on every infected had risen again as a plague zombie. But Farid hadn't lied when he had claimed the successes were much more useful. By the time it was over, thousands of poxwalkers infested the ship. The plague marines set on preparing them for the battle to come, giving them basic training and making sure they were all equipped with the bare minimum of weaponry. Their brains had been warped along with their bodies, and the cowardice and lack of discipline that had made them all but useless before had been replaced with a fierce devotion to Grandfather Nurgle and complete willingness to die in his service. Lesser demons of Nurgle began to manifest aboard, rising from the corpse piles and joining the poxwalkers. Joyous rites to Nurgle were conducted on all decks, bloating the poxwalkers with yet more contagious blessings. Several minor demon hosts were created by seemingly random chance, becoming preachers of Nurgle that exalted the virtues of surrendering to the inevitable. The poxwalkers had lost their fear of their transhuman overlords during their rebirth, and tried to drag them into their celebrations with varying degrees of success, which was a strange experience to the sons of Mortarion. All in all, it made for a great time, and the plague marines enjoyed it as much as they could, all of them knowing and accepting that the next battle may well be their last. When Petronicus managed to get hold of Archon on the Vox, the conditions in this section of the webway made communication difficult even with the Warband's advantages. The Awakened One was satisfied with the Plague Marines' work, and told Petronicus that he would be the one to lead the Nurglite contingent in the battle that would take place at the Anchor of Vul. Prince Eric of Thezar looked at the knights arrayed in their hangar aboard the Hand of Ruin as the menials prepared them for war. A heavy black cloak hung from his shoulders, on which his servants had attached strips of cloths marked with the emblems of the various enemies that had died by his hand. He wore an impeccable uniform of leather, and a ceremonial saber hung at his waist. His face remained unchanged, still displaying the noble bearing of House Lyrock, except for his eyes, which had both needed replacing with cybernetics after an engagement with a powerful witch had resulted in his cockpit being filled with warp fire. The augmetic eyes, he had politely refused the Fleshmaster's offer of more esoteric replacements, showed him the hangar with perfect clarity despite the dim lightning. He cut an imposing figure, but in truth, he was fighting to keep himself from yawning. He hadn't slept well, but then he never did these days. Since joining the Forsaken Sons on their Tsar, selling his loyalty to the Awakened One in return for his support in overthrowing his tyrant father and leaving the rebellion to try and make a better place of their world, he could count the nights when he had slept peacefully on one hand. Nightmares haunted him every time he surrendered to sleep, some born from the war he had fought against his sire, others from the wars he had waged since, and others still, the worst of all, from other places and times entirely. As the sole night pilot the Warband had in its ranks to begin with, Eric's position had been a curious one. He was above the common rank and file of the mortal armies the Chaos Marines had assembled, and even the Forsaken Sons had treated him with respect, knowing that he would be the one piloting the Giant of Metal and Death once battle was joined. But he was also a servant of Archon, bound to him by his oath, and while Eric had always taken those seriously, he wasn't foolish enough not to realize his binding to the Awakened One was of a different nature. He was no slave to the Chaos Lord, no mere puppet unable to move unless he was ordered to, but neither could he rebel against his master, no matter what orders he was given. To his quiet surprise, the wars of the Wailing Storm hadn't been all that dishonorable. By the time the Forsaken Sons reached a world, it had already sunk deep into corruption and madness, and more often than not the order the Warband brought in the name of efficiency was actually a relief to the population. The battles had been brutal, but Archon had used Indomitable as a spear point, tearing through enemy vehicles and opening breaches for the rest of the army. Eventually, the knight suits recovered from their Tsar had been repaired, and Eric had been tasked with forming the pilots that would bind with them. There had been many casualties, but eventually Eric had semi-successfully trained enough pilots for each of the repaired knights. They had been put under his command, though they had rarely been deployed together after the first few missions. Given the caliber of opposition they usually met in the Wailing Storm, sending in several knights was grossly overkill and, more importantly, a waste of resources. Ammunition and fuel were always scarce, though Mercurian's ingenuity had allowed the techno-adept to work dark miracles on the knights. The battle ahead, at this place called the Anchor, would be the first time he actually fought Imperials. Archon had kept him and the other knights in reserve during the Black Crusade, refusing their aid to the other chosen. Malone in particular had asked for them, rightly pointing out that their assistance would be of great use to him in the holding action he had been ordered to perform. Eric didn't know how to feel about it all. For all his prestige and power, he wasn't in Archon's command circle, but he had heard the rumors. He knew that the Anchor was supposed to hold the key to releasing some vast fleet of demon ships from humanity's distant past, and that both the Imperium and the Elders, he hadn't known anything about those until one of the Fleshmasters had explained the basics to him, would do anything to stop it. Having seen the Warband's demon ships in action, Eric could understand why. But he couldn't help but think he should feel more. He should be horrified at the prospect. How many billions would die if the Nightmare Fleet were freed? How many worlds would burn? And yet, he felt nothing. His service to the Forsaken Sons had slowly hollowed him, the horrors he witnessed eating out at his soul until all that remained was his code of honor, and that code demanded that he obey Archon's orders, no matter that the Awakened One was 1,000 times worse monster than Emperor Augustus Lyrock had ever been. It was the only thing he had left, the only thing that stood between him and all the living nightmares of the warp. He would hold on to it and be damned, because he was damned anyway. Belarius knelt before the angel Malone, and waited for the divine messenger's words. A lord he might be, shaped by the hands of the gods themselves, but he was still a creature of flesh and blood, separated from their grace by the necessities of his purpose, while the angel was a luminous being, and a direct agent of their will. The gods spoke through him, and it was Belarius' duty to heed the angel's words so that he could then pass them on to his people. The separation had ended, and the people of Etheric had been reunited with the gods. The fallen lords of Etheric had been slain, their spirits freed from their corrupted bodies and reunited with the glory of the gods. Only Belarius had remained, but new lords had risen in time. On Etheric, Belarius had guided his people to build great ships with which their armies could depart to bring the glory of the gods on other worlds. Though Belarius had defeated the Shadow 300 years prior, and the divide between Etheric and its gods had been healed upon his awakening as prophecy had foretold, there remained a great many evils in the cosmos, and the gods had called upon their champion to fight in their name yet again. He had answered their call gladly, and so had his people. When the angels had returned after their departure following the purge of the fallen lords, they had found Belarius ready. Several of the younger lords had been sent to a place called Meridia, to help the children of the gods who suffered under the brutal tyranny of the Shadow, living miserable existences of abject servitude. But Belarius himself, along with his close circle and most elite troops, had been marked for another, greater purpose. "We will arrive at our destination soon," said the angel, his voice echoing like golden musical notes. His face was hidden under a beautiful mask, for only the gods and the dead may look upon the true visage of their messengers. Another angel stood behind him, along with a blessed priest of the gods, who had been so exalted as to be permitted to attend their messengers. Belarius knew him, his name was Marcus, and he had been of great assistance to him in the months of their journey to the promised battle. "We are ready, exalted one," replied Belarius, kneeling before the angel with the tip of his emerald blade resting on the floor. Even in this position, his head was of a height with the angels, for the lords had been made tall, and Belarius tallest of them all. "You need but give the order, and we shall crush all the enemies of the gods in their name." "Your weapons are prepared?" "Our blades have been blessed and our armor polished," said Belarius. It was strange that the angel needed to ask such an obvious question, but then the messengers were exalted beings, whose understanding of mortal matters was limited. It was why the lords had been created in the first place. The enemies we will face soon are mighty, Belarius. Are your warriors prepared to die? Of course. Coming from another, the implication it could be otherwise would have been an insult, but the angels remembered that even the lords of Etheric had failed in their purpose before. There is no greatest honor, no higher glory, than to die in service to the gods. Those who perish shall do so gladly, and we shall praise their deeds as their spirits are reunited with the gods. I swear to you, there are no cowards among them. The angel nodded. That is good. Then we shall leave you to your final preparations, for there is much yet to be done. The two angels and the priest boarded their glorious chariot, a construct of gleaming heavenly metal and holy fire, and departed. After watching them grow distant, Belarius turned back. His duty was clear, and he wouldn't fail. That, said Igdal as the ramp of the transport closed and the gunship lifted off the near derelict carrying the mutants of Etheric, was among the most disturbing things we've ever done, and I don't say that lightly. Malone merely grunted in response. The madness of the mutants was disquieting even to the Lord of the Unbound, not that the title meant much these days, with his host slaughtered on Beranos, but it did make them easier to manage than most of the troops he'd had under his command. After some of the things he had needed to do to enforce discipline, playing along with the delusions of Belarius was positively restful. Despite his madness, Belarius is still a capable commander, said Marcus from where he sat, securely strapped in his seat's restraints. As ever, the Riven looked utterly unperturbed by what they had seen, his scarred face the picture of serenity. His troops are still only mutants enthralled by the changer of ways lies, pointed out Igdal. What if Belarius is killed and they are forced to face reality? I doubt that would go over well. I spoke with Decaros before he left the Wailing Storm, answered Malone. If Belarius dies, the other so-called lords should be able to pick up the slack. If they all die, however, the mutants will be stripped of their illusions, which, yes, will not be a pretty sight. You would think after generations, it wouldn't be a problem. None of them were ever human anyway, so it really feels like a cruel joke of Zeonch to me. Most likely, yes, agreed Malone. In any case, they will still serve. Even if they lose their minds, every body we can throw on the field of battle gives us better odds of victory. I suppose, conceded Igdal, before settling down for the rest of the trip back to the Blade of Terror. Demons flew around the gunship, but didn't attack it. Runes had been carved into its hull and infused with the blood of sacrifices, reinforcing the pact that had been made before the Forsaken Sons had passed through the Webway Gate. Their pursuers wouldn't be so protected, of course, and the attrition they would suffer during the crossing had been taken into account by Archon when planning the Black Crusade. Even now, the scale of the Awakened One's plan and the depths of his foresight awed Malone. Upon his return from Beranos, he had been told the full extent of what Archon intended, the true nature of the Grey Knights and of Archon's plan to break their power on his knee and strip the rotting Imperium of some of its most powerful protectors. Already, that plan had cost them greatly. Only 2 of the chosen of Archon were among the forces sailing toward the Anchor of Vul. Arsim had managed to escape the Grey Knights at Chemairos, but the list of the others' fate made for a grim tally. Paranepha, the Unfettered, Hector Hecaran, Karalit, they had all died. The 3 Slayer Ineshi chosen, Orpheus, Ezirithn, and Mikhail, had been left behind on Neril, and given that the Coven had confirmed the Imperials and their Xenos allies were in pursuit, their chances of survival were slim. Decaros had also remained behind, the Lord of Shadows tasked by the Awakened One to prevent the rest of the Imperial reinforcements sent to Azeroth from interfering. Right now, he should be leading the traitor Navy elements into hit-and-run campaigns against the fleets that had broken the Unbound host at Beranos, and Malone wished his peer all the Dark God's favor in the endeavor. Though the Black Crusade had slain billions, it had also bled the Forsaken Sons, costing them much of the strength they had accumulated in the Wailing Storm. But all of that would be irrelevant if they cracked the cage of the Nightmare Fleet open. Aboard the Forge barge Eidolon of Regret, Arch-Heretic Mercurian toiled on his greatest work yet. Elsewhere in the Forge barge, the flesh mills of the Dark Mechanicum were working at full capacity. New battalions of Skitarii were being spawned and equipped with newly forged augmetics and weapons. The entire stores of biological matter and metal were being spent to raise fresh troops, New lives created only to die in the coming battle, knowing nothing but the imperatives of war that were burned into their brains at birth. In great hangars, demon engines built on Argenta Primus and the Hellforge of Mulla Tertium were being prepared. But none of this concerned Mercurian. He had his own task, along with the greatest adepts of the Argentian Mechanicum, including their leader Al-Zarak. As soon as the Eidolon of Regret had joined up with the Hand of Ruin, Arkan had sent him over along with the elements that had already been built. The Lamentation occupied almost the entire chamber in which it was constructed, which was vast enough to house titans. It was made of metal and flesh, and demonic intelligences dwelled within its components, bound there by the arts of the Argentine heretics. The machine fed on power and blood, carried to it by great cables and sacrificial altars. It also bristled with transmitters, some of them freshly built, others scavenged across the wailing storm and refitted to run on Argentine warp-borne energy. The Lamentation was a speaking engine, designed to be able to communicate on every material and immaterial frequency. Some of the techniques that had been used to create the Metatrons that the Warband had employed to keep in touch during the Black Crusade had been reused in its construction, though it was much, much more complex and powerful than these early prototypes. When the Lamentation was activated, the gods themselves would hear it speak. It would carry the word of Arkan to the Nightmare Fleet itself, and make itself understood to the ancient sentiences that drove it. This was what Mercurian had been prepared for. Only now, on the eve of their greatest triumph, did the arch-heretic finally understand. For decades, Arkan had allowed him access to all manner of forbidden knowledge, encouraging Mercurian to gorge himself on the lore accumulated by the various illuminated cultures they encountered in their conquest. Wars had been waged where more diplomatic outcomes might have been reached so that he would be able to peruse sealed tomes and encrypted databanks. He had looked upon the primordial truth of the Eightfold Omnissiah from 100 different angles, gleaning a handful of new revelations each time. All this time, the Awakened One had known what he would one day ask of Mercurian. The Lamentation, for all its dark majesty, was still only a training exercise compared to what awaited him once they reached their destination. The arch-heretic would accompany Arkan in the dimensional locus that served as the lock on the Nightmare Fleet's prison. He would be brought before the devices that had bent reality and trapped the Nightmare Fleet into a dimensional oubliette, and he would bend them to his will. None of the hidebound adepts of the cult Mechanicus would have a chance of understanding the works of the ancient elders, but Mercurian had spent centuries studying machines built by madmen and geniuses, each with their unique approach. He had been trained for this, and he would not fail. The patterns of the machine were known to him, and he would find a way. He would throw open the gates that held the Nightmare Fleet at bay, and the Lamentation would forge an alliance between it and the Forsaken Sons. All who stood against them would burn, and the secrets of the Nightmare Fleet, secrets dating back to the Dark Age of technology, would be his. And with them, he would build wonders amidst the ashes of the Azarok sector as to make the false priests of Mars tremble in terror and awe. In an isolated and reinforced section of the Hall of Asclepius, Fleshmaster Savar Khan was hard at work putting the final touches on his latest work. His grandfatherly face was reflected in the panels of reinforced glass that covered several gestating pods, within which slumbered beings whose mere existence was heresy of the worst kind to all aspects of the Imperial Creed. Soon after the beginning of the Black Crusade and the victory at Silberstadt, Arkan himself had summoned him to his sanctum. The Awakened One had given him a data slate and a decryption key of the type used to secure Exterminatus-grade weaponry, and told him this would be his job for the foreseeable future. Inside the data slate had been the notes of Paranefa, when the fool had tried to clone the Primarchs, and, against all odds, actually managed to somewhat pull it off. His children of woe had been killed in battle, with the last one becoming Seraxithar's vessel and almost killing Arkan in the final hours of the war for Paraxis. But they had still been powerful assets, and Arkan wasn't willing to hold anything back in the name of fulfilling the Black Crusade's goals. For the first time in centuries, there was a reason a Terran-born had survived among the Night Lords long enough to join the Forsaken Sons. Savar Khan had actually argued with a superior officer. But Arkan hadn't budged, and eventually, Savar Khan had agreed. Even with the complete genetic code stored within the data slate, it had been difficult, gruesome, but interesting work. Without the samples Paranefa had access to, he had been forced to take shortcuts. Fortunately, these new children of woe were only meant to serve as disposable weapons, not long-term assets. Savar Khan had plundered the research of his peers, requisitioning valuable materials as well as using demonic assistants to fill in the gaps. There had been many false starts, and his bolt pistol had put down many of his own creations as they broke free and tried to kill him. In the end, the Fleshmaster had managed to create 7 children of woe, though one of them looked like it wouldn't survive for much longer. They twitched inside their pods, kept quiescent by powerful cocktails of tranquilizers. None of them were free of mutations, and it was all but impossible to tell which bloodline their genetics had originally been based on, before Savar Khan's improvisations had defiled it to make it viable. His work had been kept from the rest of the Warband, and even from the other Fleshmasters. Even among the Forsaken Sons, there were lines whose crossing made the warriors uncomfortable, and this was most definitely one of them. The Forsaken Sons held no love for their failed fathers, but the innate distrust of cloning remained. There was no point in testing their tolerance, not when secrecy was so much easier. The oversized weapons Mercurian had forged at Arkan's request rested at the opposite side of the room, waiting for their wielders. There was no armor, the children of woe were too deviated from their original templates for that, their bodies racked by unchecked mutation. Their innate resilience and regeneration ability would have to suffice. He ran the final checks on each of the children of woe, seeing all values within acceptable parameters. Everything was ready, now all he needed was for Arsam to do his part in the Awakened One's latest blasphemous scheme. Arsam stood in the presence of 6 demon lords and waited for them to give their answer to his offer. The Neverborn were not truly manifested. In the physical reality of the ritual room on the Hand of Ruin, the Sorcerer Lord knelt at the center of a complex ritual circle, with 6 objects laying on the edge. The circle served as an intermediary between his mind and the infernal essence bound within each relic, allowing him to make psychic contact with them without giving them access to his body and soul. He had called on the help of every member of the coven to check the circle before beginning, to make sure not a single weakness remained. The rest of the coven were busy in other rooms not too dissimilar to this one, summoning demons and binding them within the bodies of Imperials taken prisoner at Silberstadt. The repeated work would mean the bindings wouldn't hold for long, and the demon hosts would need to be handled like unstable explosives, but they would still make for a powerful force if they could be aimed at the enemy. Even after all that, it would still only last for an hour at best. He didn't have the same resources as when he had repeatedly made contact with the imprisoned, but fortunately, these demons were much more amenable than the ancient horror had been. Each of the 6 relics, from the bone knife engraved with glowing runes that had driven generations of priests to sacrifice innocents to the dark gods to the mummified head of the possessed tyrant king of 4 Morrows, had been taken by the Forsaken Sons during their conquest of the Wailing Storm. Until now, they had been locked away in the vaults of the Awakened One, trapped within stasis fields and powerful wards. After Arsam had arrived on the Hand of Ruin from Chemairos, Arkan had broken the seals and handed over the relics to the Sorcerer of Blood. If they were to stand a chance against the Grey Knights who would doubtlessly come for them, they would have to use every asset at their disposal. Which was why Arsam's mind now lurked in the psychic shadows of the powerful demons bound within the relics. Each of the demons was unique, for they stood high in the complex hierarchies of the Neverborn. Not so high as to be princes or favored scions, the greater demons whose thread made entire worlds tremble in terror, but powerful nonetheless, and possessed of their own identities. With the protections between him and them, Arsam could only glimpse impressions of their true and terrible forms. One cast the shadow of 6 wings. Another reeked of dirty swamp water, while a third gave off the smoke that rose from the pyre of the unjustly condemned. 2 more were like opposite reflections of one another, with one shining with blinding light that formed impossible shapes and the other an abyss that swallowed all light as if it were a dead star. Most curious was the one who gave off only the impression of an empty throne. Merely contemplating it, even through the many layers of protections, made Arsam uneasy. The bargain Arsam offered the demons was simple. It had not required the intercession of the Herald of Blood, which was fortunate given the creature had mostly left him alone since Carthago's ghost had attached herself to him. The demons would be freed from their prisons and given new bodies to inhabit in the Materium, powerful ones that would be able to bear their power and that they could reshape as they pleased. In return, they would fight alongside the Forsaken Sons and each other in the battle against the Imperium and their Eldar allies. After that battle, they would be free to do as they pleased. Powerful oaths would be required to seal the deal, the sort of pact that could not be broken without consequence. Of course, That also meant that if Savarkhan failed to deliver the bodies they needed, Asim would still be compelled to procure satisfying alternatives lest he and the Warband be the one to bear the backlash of the broken bargain. He would rather avoid damning 6 of his kinsmen by turning them into demon hosts, but he knew Arkan would give them to him if need be. The Awakened One was nothing if not ruthlessly pragmatic, and had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt he was willing to sacrifice his brothers in the name of fulfilling his goals. Finally, just as Asim felt he would need to ask again, the first of the demon lords answered. Its response wasn't couched in words, but Asim's mind interpreted it as such, yes. And once the first of them had accepted, the others each did as well, unwilling to be left behind while the others escaped their confines. The oaths were sworn, and Asim felt them tighten around what little remained of his soul after so many years of making deals like this. Atop one of the dorsal spires of the Hand of Ruin, Arkan the Awakened, Lord of the Forsaken Suns, stood with his unsleeping gaze aimed at the warp-corrupted darkness of the webway. He was in the same chamber where he had opened the path out of the wailing storm, sounding the beginning of his black crusade at the cost of his own freedom and soul. Most of the relics that had filled this chamber were gone, taken elsewhere in the great ship to be put to use in the battle to come. Those that were left were so terrible or uncontrollable that using them was guaranteed to hurt the Forsaken Sons more than their enemies, and Arkan had only kept them because destroying them would be even more dangerous. Even with the Gellerfield raised, looking directly outside was dangerous, but Arkan was long since past such perils. He had rent reality itself asunder in order to open the way for his troops, and his soul was bathed in the energies of chaos. What threat did the vista of the tainted webway have to offer to one such as he? At least one, it turned out, though it did not come from the ruinous powers. As Arkan watched the raging hellscape smashing against the Hand of Ruin's Gellerfield, his mind began to wander, as it often did when he wasn't active. He might never sleep, but his mind still needed respite, and sought it in waking dreams and visions that were equally fueled by his subconscious and by the dark gods to whom he had bartered away his soul. His surroundings faded from sight, replaced by a plane of infinite darkness, where clusters of pale stars cast shifting shadows. He heard something from far away. A whisper, which then became a voice, repeating one word over and over. Arkan. 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 I am here, he announced to the blackness. Congratulations, you have found me. Now show yourself before my patience runs out. A stranger who wasn't a stranger stepped out of the blackness. He was tall, taller than Arkan in his Terminator armor that had long since fused to his flesh. He wore a simple cloth tunic, white with silver thread woven through in arcane patterns, and a sword was sheathed at his side. As he came into view, the shadows fled from him, leaving him standing on a patch of nothingness as he looked at Arkan with mismatched eyes. Here, in this place of metaphors and nightmares, the left and right halves of his face looked like they belonged to 2 different people, yet moved as one. Janus, said Arkan, his lips curling into a wolf's smile. I was wondering if I would hear from you before the end. The astral projection of the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights remained silent for a moment, looking the Awakened One up and down. Have you nothing to say? Taunted Arkan. We both know there is nothing either of us can do to the other here. This is not how our battle ends, the gods would not allow it. Janus met Arkan's gaze and held it. The Awakened One had stared into the realms of chaos themselves, and fought against a demon prince of Xionch alone. Yet even so, he still felt a twinge of discomfort at the depths of power, knowledge, and grief that lurked within the Grey Knight's eyes. This was the face of the enemy, the great champion of the anathema in the material universe, and the one Arkan had sworn to kill. Arkan, he said again, his lips remaining sealed. Is that your name? Is that all that you are? No family. No bloodline. No clan. Just a name. Arkan of the Lunar Wolves. Arkan of the Sons of Horus. It was common enough on Chthoniya, even among those taken for the Legion. Our world didn't exactly lend itself to recording lineages. Indeed. Is that why your gene line is so obsessed with glory? Because you fear your name will fade if you do not make your mark upon the galaxy? Arkan shrugged. Who knows? Chthoniya bred us strong, and we took that strength with us into the stars. Chthoniya. They burned that world, you know. They shattered it and turned it to dust. Of course, there weren't many left on it by then. The cullings and the purges of those disloyal to the Warmaster did most of the killing for them. And the children, how many children were taken from Chthoniya during the war, Arkan? How many were torn from the hands of their mothers, to be gene-forged into instruments of Horus' will? How many of these forsaken sons linger now, the cause for which they were remade but never understood nothing but ash? Tens of thousands were taken, only thousands of whom survived the accelerated trials and gene seed implantation, replied Arkin. As you well know, the Hand of Ruin served as a troop transport during the later years of the rebellion, when all legions were becoming desperate to get new recruits. Since Chthoniya was destroyed in the Scouring and most of my former legion fled to the Eye of Terror, I may very well be the last son of Horus to see our home world. And what of the daughters of Chthoniya? What happened to them, in the dark tunnels where there was only war? Arkin remained silent. I know what you did, when Horus sent you to bring more warriors. I know where the newborn legionaries that were thrown at Dawn's defenses came from. Your sin wasn't forgotten. I know what was done to the children born females so that the Legion may have more sons to take, the forbidden technologies you employed to find more recruits to fill the ranks of the 16th Legion. Death and life can both be sinful, Arkin, when looked at through the lens of madness. He laughed. Is that it? I have burned worlds and dragged billions of souls into the warp. I have orchestrated this Black Crusade and schemes the unleashing of a force that might lay waste to the entire segmentum. Yet you expect me to be shaken by what I did on Chthoniya in order to get more warriors to throw at the walls of the Imperial Palace? Blood is blood. Pain is pain. Death is death. The details don't matter, in the end, it all feeds chaos. Jaina's face was a mask of righteous wrath. Judgment comes for you, Arkin. You cannot run from it, no matter how hard you try. I run from nothing, snarled the awakened one. I'll be waiting for you, Janus. Try to stop me, if you can. With a pulse of will, the Chaos Lord severed the connection Janus had managed to establish between them, and found himself back aboard the Hand of Ruin, staring into the webway. The whispers of the dark gods, which had been silenced during the vision, rushed back into his ears. Soon, he said, though whether he was talking to himself or his patrons, he didn't know. Soon, the anchor of Vul. 745.m32. The fleet of the Forsaken Sons exited the webway and returned into reality far from the warp routes the ships of humanity sailed. When last the Nightmare Fleet had haunted the galaxy, the Elders had been unable to meet it in open combat, and had instead resorted to deception. They had built the Anchor of Vul in secret, in a place accessible only through a single webway gate, and not even told their own about its true purpose. Instead, the other Elders who fought the Nightmare Fleet had been told that a great weapon was being constructed, one that would wipe out entire sectors in order to extinguish the threat of the Nightmare Fleet. Entire star systems had been destroyed as tests to sell the deception, entire life-bearing worlds annihilated for that purpose. When these Elders had been taken prisoners and brought to the pain engines of the Nightmare Fleet, their knowledge had been extracted, and the sentient machines had moved to neutralize that threat, inadvertently walking directly into their enemy's trap. The greatest Eldar fleet still in the region had engaged the Nightmare Fleet, holding it in place long enough for the anchor to activate and trap them all in a dimensional oubliette. The anchor had then been abandoned, entrusted to automated maintenance mechanisms, while the Elders continued their headlong descent into hedonism, some of whom eventually becoming the creatures that would be reborn as the Shai-Ilat. Arkin knew this, for he had ripped the knowledge from demons that had taken part in that apocalyptic battle, when their bodies of iron and mutated flesh had been destroyed by the Elders and their spirits hurled back into the Empyrean in a shameful defeat that had still spared them from the imprisonment that had befallen their comrades. Parsing the truth from their lies had been a challenge, but Arkin was nothing if not determined. And there, in the void, light years away from the nearest star system, was the Anchor of Vul. It was vast, bigger than any spacefaring construct any of the Forsaken Sons had ever seen, except for those few who had encountered Eldar craft worlds during the Great Crusade. It was made of a black metal and shaped like a multifaceted diamond. At its point rested a singularity, where time and space were bent by the entire machinery of the anchor, forever maintaining the dimensional oubliette where the Nightmare Fleet and the ships of the Eldar Empire had been banished to. Not even the dark tech auspexes of the Hand of Ruin could make sense of the readings the singularity gave off. Several of the servitors on the bridge simply blew up in the attempt. Beneath the anchor hung a solitary star, stolen from its rightful place by ancient Elders and placed here to serve as a power source for the anchor. Filaments of liquid fire, each weighing trillions of kilograms, rose from its surface and plunged into the anchor's base, where a great hole led into the mechanisms that turned raw starfire into energy. The star was being slowly murdered to fuel the great engine, though at this rate it would take millions of years before the effects became evident. Given how long the Eldar Empire had supposedly stood for, this was remarkably short-sighted of its builders, and spoke of either the desperation they had been in or of how they had already begun their descent into decadence by that point. A great, translucent sphere surrounded the anchor. Ancient Eldar runes were inscribed on its surface, and the demonic intelligences of the fleet shuddered in displeasure at the sight, but their masters drove them onward. The Hand of Ruin sailed at the head of the armada, an alpha predator leading its pack. In his chamber, Arkan watched the anchor of Vol grow through the window as they approached. The ever-present whispers of the gods had grown into a chorus of voices since they had left the webway, and it took a constant effort of will for his mind to remain focused on the material reality around him. One that he knew he wouldn't be able to keep up forever. He was running out of time, in more ways than one, but it would all be worth it when he succeeded here. The shield was more than a defense against physical attacks, he saw with senses that couldn't be put into words. It was also a ward, designed to keep demons from the anchor. It had been powerful, enough so to keep the anchor safe throughout the millennia since, but it was also old, and called upon the names of gods that had died when Slanch had been born. "Shipmaster Koldak," he called out over the vox. "Yes, my lord?" "Take down this fragile veil, if you would. The techno-sorcery of dead Xenos will not keep me from my prize." "As you command, my lord." As the Hand of Ruin fired, Arkan brought down his claws, infusing the attack with a portion of the awful might that churned within his soul. The lance beam slammed into the shield, and with a sound that echoed through the immaterium like a tired sigh, it broke apart and vanished. A series of explosions were reported on the megastructure's surface as the shield generators were overloaded by the backlash, but such was its scale they were barely visible as more than brief pinpricks of light. The anchor of Vol was open to the Forsaken Sons. Of course, they couldn't just fire at it until it broke apart. Arkan had considered it during his planning, but the sheer mass of the engine, combined with the unknown materials used in its construction, made such an approach non-viable, especially with the Imperials and Elders on their heels. No, they would have to sabotage the anchor from within. There were vast bays open to the void near the middle of the anchor, where the crafts of the Elders had landed to bring the considerable resources and personnel that had gone into building this station. They were immense, each one vast enough to fit an entire city of tens of thousands of souls inside, yet they barely occupied a fraction of the floor of the anchor on which they were located. Several gunships were sent as scouts, carrying squads of Forsaken Sons in full armor. They reported that there was gravity inside the anchor, pointing down to the star and the larger end of the station, as well as a breathable atmosphere, maintained by Ian's old life support systems that had endured through thousands of years with only automated maintenance. Some kind of energy field prevented the atmosphere from venting into the void, but was no obstacle to their transports. No defensive mechanisms had been found so far, though the scouts had only explored the outermost region of the anchor. Satisfied with this preliminary inspection, Arkan ordered his forces to disembark on the anchor. The ships drew near the anchor, and a flow of transports began going back and forth, delivering thousands and thousands of damned souls aboard the ancient station, directed by the remaining chosen and sub-commanders of the Warband. Demon engines, Chaos Knights, and other, more esoteric assets were also brought aboard, while the Forsaken Sons explored deeper, searching for defensive positions as well as ways up the megastructure and command centers. Before long, however, the transmission came from the rest of the fleet: the enemy had arrived. The battle began the instant the Imperials and Elders exited the webway. The Forsaken Sons had left hundreds of mines behind them, some of them hastily built from plundered explosives, others crafted in the hellforges of the Wailing Storm. Their detonations brought down the shields of the ships that had been sent in the first wave, Imperial and Eldar vessels both, due to the conditions in the webway having forced the Xenos to seek shelter in the Imperial's Geller envelope. Before the Allies could recover, they came under attack. Having delivered their troops to the anchor of Vol, the ships of the Forsaken Sons had prepared an ambush right at the gate, knowing their enemies had no other way to enter the artificial system. The Hand of Ruin, its holds empty of all but her necessary crew and a bare-bone complement of Astartes, each of whom had sworn an oath to die before they retreated, so consumed with the desire to bleed the Imperium that they cared naught for their survival, descended upon the fleet at a perpendicular plane, seeming to plunge on them from above. At its side were the demon ships and other vessels, all of them unleashing their firepower in a synchronized, devastating volley. The Allied commanders weren't fools, and their fleet had emerged through the gate with their shields raised at maximum, fully expecting an ambush. Even so, they had known the first ships to pass through were at the most risk, with only seconds to focus their shields in the direction of the foe before they were hit. Between the mines and the first volley, tens of thousands perished in the first moments of the Void battle, with several ships being completely destroyed before reinforcements arrived and the Allied fleet began to maneuver to face the Chaos Armada. On the bridge of the Blade of Terror, Morkoth watched it all unfold on screens made of living crystal and projections that were windows into the nightmarish mind of the demon ship. The Unbound could read the truth of the demonic display in front of him without difficulty, and he didn't like what it told him. On their own, the Imperial or Eldar fleet would have been defeated easily enough. Together, they formed a force powerful enough to defeat what was present of the scattered armada of the Forsaken Sons. Of course, if the fleet hadn't been dispersed across Azeroth, then they would be facing a much greater foe, and the odds would be even worse. They were throwing everything at the Imperial and Eldar fleets, well, everything except for one. The Eidolon of Regret, aboard which the Lamentation waited for the arrival of the Nightmare fleet, had been sent far from the gate and the anchor. It would have made for a powerful force in the Void battle, but the Lamentation couldn't be risked, and bringing it aboard the anchor would have left it dangerously exposed. Given its size, there was no way to bring the machine deeper than the vast landing bays, where it would have been hopelessly vulnerable. If they were to have any chance of controlling the Nightmare fleet, they needed the Lamentation, which meant the Eidolon of Regret had to stay safe. At least the Forge Barge's 3 escorts, the nameless dagger cruisers, had been willing to leave their flagship to participate in the battle. The kill counts kept increasing, showing an exact tally of how many had died. The Blade of Terror didn't rely on auspexes for those, instead pulling the information straight out of the warp, where the souls of the dead were sent. Only the Eldar casualty count was an estimate, since their souls were protected inside those spirit stones, which could sometimes survive even the destruction of the ship around them. The number kept ticking up and up, as more succumbed to fires, wounds, and void exposure. The arrival of the rest of the fleet through the gate, including their command ships, prevented the battle from turning into a complete rout. Eldar cruisers and frigates moved among the comparatively slow and clumsy Imperial vessels, finally able to use their full mobility after so long forced to cling to the Imperial's Geller fields. Wings of fighters were deployed to intercept the Forsaken Sons' torpedoes and missiles, while formations reformed to close the holes that had been opened in them. The mines and the ambush had already dealt many casualties to the Allied forces, yet they were but one of the prongs of the Forsaken Sons' plan. The third trap the Forsaken Sons had laid for their pursuers rested in the webway, on the other side of the gate. At the end of the path to Nightmares, the Allied commanders had realized the likelihood that an ambush was waiting for them on the other side, and ordered that their troop transports, slow, ponderous ships with few weapons, to stay behind while the warships cleared the way. They had left a few escort ships behind to protect the transports from the horrors of the path to Nightmares, but they had made the mistake of assuming that not even the Forsaken Sons could survive in the warp-tainted webway without the protection of a Geller field. They were wrong. Directed by a warpsmith aboard a heavily modified and warded fighter, a flock of horrors had hidden in the folds of the corrupted webway, their energy signatures and darkling souls hidden by the madness surrounding them. For several hours, the warpsmith had endured the ceaseless whispers of immaterial warp spirits, his gaze fixed on the gate, waiting for the perfect moment. Now the signal had been given, and a tide of flying nightmares descended upon the troop transports. In that flock were four-winged, four-limbed cybernetic horrors with razor-sharp claws and heavy cannons protruding from the shoulders of limbless torsos. They were those of the Unkindness who had survived the Battle of Beranos and taken refuge in the Eidolon of Regret, now unleashed without any restraint whatsoever. They flew far faster than the swarms of Furies and other winged demons that had hurled themselves at the Imperials during their journey, dodging enemy fire and going straight for the transports, all but ignoring their escorts. Among them was the creature that thought of itself as the Alpha, who had once been an Unbound before being transformed into a dark tech cyborg as part of the pact Malone had made with the creatures. The Unkindness made up most of the flock, but they weren't alone. Most fighters of the Forsaken Sons fleet couldn't survive in the path to Nightmares, but those that could had been left behind to bulk up their numbers. Winged Argentine demon engines flew as well, though none were greater than the leader of the onslaught, whose metal chassis had first been assembled in the hallowed forges of Mars itself. The creature that had once been Perseus Killes, personal pilot of the Awakened One and his Terminator bodyguards, flew on wings of metal and warp fire, blatantly defying the laws of physics that asserted that wings were useless in the airless tunnels of the warp-tainted webway. It had been many years since Perseus had become unable to leave the gunship he had piloted for the Warband's master, his flesh fusing to the pilot's seat. His proximity to the Awakened One had drawn the attention of the ruinous powers, and they had rewarded his faithful service to their champion, though, as was often the case, their gifts had been unasked for. Slowly, more and more of Perseus' body and soul had been subsumed in the gunship, which was equally warped by its time in the wailing storm. Eventually, Archon had been forced to stop using it as a transport, as Perseus completed his transformation into something that, in another time and place, would come to be called a Helldrake. Demarion's squad had adopted the demon engine as a pet, feeding it captives and letting it loose during their battles of conquest. The sight of a black and gold dragon flying through the skies, delivering fiery death through its immolating breath, did wonders to break the morale of populations that had regressed to feudal levels. Despite the hideous transformation, something of Perseus remained, for only the Forsaken Sun's Terminator elite could approach the Helldrake safely. Not even the heretics and maintenance servitors were safe from its violent temper. Perseus passed through the Geller field of one of the bigger transports, hissing in pain as its touch, but his metal body was proof against the field's repelling effect. With claws that had once been landing gear, he tore through the metal plating that stood between him and his prey. On the other side of the barrier, the air trembled with the sound of metal tearing apart, until Perseus had made enough of a hole to pass through, forcing his body of metal and hatred across the opening. Meat things ran about in all directions, filling the ether with the tantalizing scent of their terror. The inside of the hangar was full of Imperial guardsmen. Their officers had made them ready to depart on a moment's notice so that they could join the final battle against the Forsaken Sons, though few knew anything about what manner of battle it would be. That preparedness, that determination to be ready to do their emperor-given duty, would be their doom. Perseus opened his maw and unleashed a torrent of warp fire upon them as they shouted and took aim at him, their last bolts smashing uselessly against his armored body. Their defiant shouts turned to agonized screams as their flesh was bathed in warp fire, their flak armor offering no protection against its ravenous hunger. Perseus moved his neck left and right, filling the hangar with fire, before climbing down the wall and engaging the closest of the tanks that had survived the inferno with his claws. Behind him, more Chaos fighters were pouring through the opening he had made. Elsewhere, the same scene played as the unkindness tore the nigh defenseless transports apart. Some went inside and culled the troops, while others targeted the ship's vital components, condemning thousands to death by suffocation or freezing as life support systems went down, or were simply obliterated as reactors went critical. As transport after transport was lost, the survivors began an emergency exit, fleeing out of the webway and into the void battle outside, their captains determining that their chances of survival were higher with the protection of the rest of the fleet. Morkoth saw the Imperial transports pass through the gate at full speed, and knew that the ambush must have unfolded as planned. There were still many of the troop carriers left, and they lacked proper intelligence on the strength their foes had been able to pull from the burning Azeroth sector. But Morkoth had seen the unkindness at work, and he didn't doubt thousands of souls had been sent screaming to the dark gods on the other side of the gate. Not that the slaughter was over. The Chaos fighters were following their prey across, visible on the Blade of Terror's screens as a swarm of wriggling black dots. Transport gunships fled from damaged troop carriers, saving as many soldiers as possible, while Space Marines were sent to kill the dark tech constructs that had boarded others, and fighters were redirected to deal with this new threat. Morkoth felt more than saw the shift in the balance of the void battle, and the opening it provided. So did Koldak, the shipmaster of the Hand of Ruin. Since the beginning of the void battle, the Hand of Ruin had been targeting the battle barge at the center of the enemy formation, a massive silver vessel that made the demon ship's infernal consciousness screech in discomfort even worse than the wards around the anchor had, before they had been brought down. The ship didn't broadcast identifiers, but it clearly belonged to the Grey Knights, those mysterious demon hunters that had destroyed Jerib's Black Temple on Baranos and killed almost every chosen of Archon in the Azeroth sector. That ship wouldn't go down easily, that much was clear. But there were other priority targets, and across the Forsaken Sons fleet, efforts were underway to identify them. Data savants who had peered into the infinite madness of chaos scanned the Imperial communications, identifying the ships carrying the enemy commanders. To Morkoth's mild surprise, one of them appeared to be a simple frigate, though a closer inspection of the ship showed additions to the standard Imperial pattern as well as the symbol of the Inquisition. Even as he directed the Blade of Terror through the fight, the Unbound saw the assault rams lead from another of the rebel ships, the Keening Whale, aimed at the frigate Judgment's Will. Gods, the Imperials could be such self-righteous pompous bastards, and that was from someone captaining a demon ship called the Blade of Terror. Turning his gaze away from the inquisitorial frigate, Morkoth felt a vicious smile creep on his face as he focused on killing as many enemies as possible. Once again, the corridors of the Judgment's Will echoed with gunfire as the ship's defenders fought against invaders serving the ruinous powers. This time, however, the intruders had guns of their own, rather than claws, teeth, and unnatural powers. A squad of Forsaken Sons had boarded the frigate, their boarding torpedo having slammed into the ship's side. It had dug through the plating and unleashed its lethal cargo into the upper decks. Alphon and Tyrion's squad were running toward the sounds of battle, passing by the mutilated corpses of slain crew members. Their kill team had been the nearest to the boarding point, but nearest was a relative term in a city-sized ship. They had been running for 20 minutes, and already hundreds had perished to the rampaging Chaos Marines. "They are moving towards the Engineerium," said Tyrion. Despite the exertion, he didn't sound tired, merely in pain. His wounds were acting up again, and there was only so much he could do to ignore them. "I know," replied Alphon over the short-range Vox network. The Engineerium was well defended, of course. The tech priests who worked inside made damn sure this was the best fortified section of the ship, and Elidios had increased those protections further when he had taken ownership of the frigate. But these defenses wouldn't keep a determined pack of boarders at bay forever, and if the Forsaken Sons got the Engineerium they could destroy the entire ship, or at the very least cripple it and leave it defenseless in the ongoing void battle. The closer to the Engineerium they got, the higher the quality of the corpses they passed. Crew, servitors, and guardsmen who had been hastily redeployed to the Judgment's Will to replenish its defenders after the casualties taken at Neril, all of them had been cut through like chaff by the invaders. Some were still alive, thrown aside by the Forsaken Sons and slowly bleeding to death. Alphon's kill team couldn't afford the time to aid them, and they ran past them even as they weakly begged for assistance. The sealed gates of the Engineerium had already been breached by the time they arrived, burned through with demolition charges whose explosion they had felt several hundred meters away. Beyond the entrance, the Engineerium was still full of the deafening noises of the great engines that kept the frigate alive, so loud that the sounds of battle barely could be heard. The battle servitors and their tech priests overseers were still fighting against the intruders, but it was clear they were losing the fight. Knowing that each of the surviving tech priests was more important to the ongoing survival of the ship than their own, Alphon's kill team bellowed a belligerent war cry as they struck, drawing the attention of the renegades on them and away from the tech priests. The Inquisitor and heir of Sanguinius charged ahead of the group, with the stormtroopers providing covering fire. There were only 3 of the traitors still standing, with 2 more laying on the floor dead. Their armor was black and gold, and bore the image of the chained demon head upon their shoulder or chest. Unlike loyal Space Marines, who could be difficult to tell apart to the untrained eye, each of the Chaos Marine was an utterly unique blend of mutation and equipment customization. The Chaos Marines were hideously mutated, the evidence of their corruption on display for all to see as if daring the universe to strike them down for their many sins. They had horns and claws, blasphemous runes that burned with fell power, and helmets warped into terrifying infernal visages. In the moment before battle was joined, Alphon took in some of the weirder details, a tail that ended with an 8-pointed metal star, a plasma pistol with a muzzle shaped like a weeping human face, a helmet with 9 glowing red eyes. Then he was fighting for his life, and there was no time to observe, no time for anything except stabbing, shooting, and dodging. His power armor could protect him from bolt shells, chainswords and power weapons, but Alphon had learned early in his life that just because you could tank an attack head-on, it didn't mean you shouldn't get the hell out of the way whenever you could. You didn't realize just how fast Astartes moved until you fought them. Even watching them fight wasn't the same, then you didn't put your own reflexes and speed against theirs, knowing full well a single mistake could mean your death. Power armor helped, but it wasn't enough. Space Marines had power armor of their own, after all, and they were just better at killing than any human could ever hope to be. But there was more to fighting than the baseline abilities of one's flesh, and while this Forsaken Son was a veteran of years of dark conquests, Alphon was no neophyte himself. He read the minute motion of the warrior's armor, reacting to his next moves before he had made them and deflecting or dodging out of the way of every blow. "You fight well, mortal," said the Forsaken Son after a flurry of exchanges that barely lasted 5 seconds. The surprise in his voice was evident, and frankly a little insulting. Alphon didn't answer. What would be the point? There wasn't any time to gain by engaging the traitor in discussion, and he didn't think the Chaos Marine would be distracted by anything he said. For all his experience in killing heretics, Alphon wasn't particularly well versed in combat taunts. Silence was his best shot at needling the Forsaken Son's pride. Judging by the annoyed growl of his enemy and his renewed aggression, that was working. Great. He dodged under a blow from a scimitar covered in a power field that passed close enough to his head it briefly blinded him as it interfered with the optics of his helmet, and plunged his sword into the waist of the Chaos Marine, burying it through the nest of cables and ripping it free in one single motion. You didn't impale a Space Marine, not if you didn't want him to rip you apart before his body registered that it was dead. Tainted blood poured out of the wound, and the traitor groaned in pain, but didn't otherwise appear hindered by what would have been a crippling blow on a human. Alphon moved out of the way of a kick, moving backward and, now, he threw himself to the side, leaving himself entirely exposed to a strike by the Forsaken Son, but also opening the line of fire of the stormtroopers. The highly trained warriors didn't miss their cue, and unleashed a concentrated volley from their hellguns, cutting through the Chaos Marine's armor and incinerating half of his torso. For one horrifying moment, he remained standing, and Alphon thought he was about to die. Then he fell. A life that had endured through the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, the Scouring and all the centuries since brought to an unceremonious end by weapons wielded by mortals. There was, Alphon briefly reflected as he hurried back to his feet and to where the last Forsaken Son fought. The second one had been slain by Tyrion, though the captain hadn't gone through the duel intact, a certain poetic justice in that. Names had power in the warp, and the dark gods had a wicked sense of humor. For decades, Koldak had always been called Shipmaster, by everyone from the lowliest slave to the Awakened One himself. As was tradition on board Astartes vessels, the mortal commander of the ship didn't bear the title of captain, to avoid confusion with the other officers bearing that rank among the legionaries. The Forsaken Sons had abandoned the titles they had borne before the Siege of Terra, embracing a more fluid hierarchy with Archon at the top, his various chosen beneath him, and the pack leaders underneath them. But the title of Shipmaster had remained attached to Koldak. The ruinous powers had heard that name, and decided to make it more literal. Following a particularly difficult crossing in the Wailing Storm, Koldak had found that he could no longer leave his command throne on the bridge of the Hand of Ruin. His limbs had been swallowed in his throne, his body permanently fused to his station. Yet despite the horror of his condition, Koldak hadn't been that bothered by it. It didn't stop him from doing his duty, and it came with advantages. He no longer needed to eat, drink or sleep. The Hand of Ruin itself sustained him. He could feel what happened to the ship as if it were his own flesh, and speak his orders across the entire vessel without needing to ask for a Vox officer's assistance. Such a degree of union between flesh and machine was the dream of the Mechanicum, and the heretics of the Warband fought for the right to attend to him and the Warband's flagship. Of course, a human mind couldn't possibly manage something the size of the Hand of Ruin alone, so he still needed the help of his bridge crew, but all in all, he was rather satisfied with his condition. It could have been much, much worse after all. At least he had retained all of his intellectual faculties, something that was never guaranteed when it came to the gifts of the gods. So it was that Shipmaster Koldak saw the ongoing battle through the auspexes of the Hand of Ruin as well as through the oculus with his own mortal eyes. He had 100 windows into the fight, and each one showed him only violence. He had thrown the Hand of Ruin in the middle of the foe like a spear, and they had inflicted great casualties to the unnatural alliance they faced, but it wasn't enough. He had been given a task by the Awakened One, before the Lord of the Forsaken Sons had departed to join his forces aboard the antediluvian Eldar construct, and he would fulfill it. There, in the middle of the enemy fleet. The Fire of Dawn. He recognized it from Archon's descriptions, though it could hardly be mistaken for any other ship. Powerful technologies surrounded it, masking it from all but the most heretical of auspexes, but the Hand of Ruin was old, and had seen through more elaborate deceits in its time. Koldak felt that these veils weren't meant to hide the battle barge from its foes, however, but its own allies. For some reason, the Grey Knights were obsessed with secrecy, and certainly the movements of the Imperial ships made more sense if they didn't know of this powerful ally's presence. The Hand of Ruin despised the Fire of Dawn like nothing else. Koldak could feel the ship's fury and disgust, curdled into white-hot hatred. Like Koldak, the Hand of Ruin had been reshaped by the warp, altered to suit the temper of its unsleeping master, to reflect the dark passions and desires of the Awakened One. Aboard the Fire of Dawn was everything Archon and his warband fought against, everything about the Imperium they despised and had sworn to bring down. Every weapon along the Hand of Ruin's 11 kilometers length fired, again and again, whether automated or reloaded by slave crews whipped into action by black-masked overseers. The battleship plunged deeper and deeper into the enemy formation, leaving a trail of broken and burning wrecks in its wake, but taking wounds of its own in return as the Imperial and Eldar ships recognized it as the flagship of the Warband and sought to destroy it. Eventually, the shields failed, but the Hand of Ruin continued on its path. It was too massive to be brought low so easily. Koldak forced the engines to burn hotter, propelling the Hand of Ruin toward its prey. The Fire of Dawn was mighty, but it was still only a battle barge. The Hand of Ruin could kill it, even if Koldak had to ram it. There was a flash of burning light that blinded Koldak's mortal eyes, and Space Marine Terminators in silver armor manifested out of the ether, immediately setting to work killing everyone on the bridge. They moved with merciless efficiency, unhindered by doubt or mercy. The Forsaken Sons guarding the bridge tried to stop them, only to be cut down in turn, their centuries-long crusade against the Imperium coming to an unceremonious end at the hand of silver-clad killers. Koldak roared his defiance and his hatred at them. Responding to his fury, the armrests of his throne grew into heavy machine guns and opened fire, letting loose volleys of warp-infused shells that tore one of the boarders to shreds before he could react. The others responded quickly, focusing the fire of their combi bolters on the shipmaster. Within seconds, all that was left of Koldak was a pile of charred meat and sparkling cables. Killing a ship's commanding officer was always a crippling blow, but in the Hand of Ruin's case it was even worse due to Koldak's unholy union with the vessel. With Koldak's death and the devastation of the bridge, the twisted machine spirit of the flagship lost the equivalent of its frontal lobe, the part of its composite mind that had handled the coordination of its many functions. The Grey Knights had cut off the head of the Hand of Ruin. Without leadership, the Great Void ship was little more than a floating mass of metal and mutated flesh. Repair teams of heretics and servitors ran without knowing how to prioritize their work, while engines overheated and ammunition depots detonated. Things that had dwelled in the lower holds of the ship for centuries rose from their territories in feeding frenzies, and the last moments of crew whose ancestors had known only the insides of the ship for generations were filled with terror and pain. Seeing its weakness, the Allied fleet redoubled its onslaught, slamming lance after lance and broadside after broadside into the Hand of Ruin, until, at last, it was too much. To the very end, the malign intelligence of the ship continued to lash out, trying to take its prey down with it, but it couldn't. The Fire of Dawn suffered many injuries, its shields falling under the strain of the final bombardment and its hull pockmarked with impacts, but it endured, even as the Hand of Ruin finally died. Morkoth cursed as he saw the flagship of the Forsaken Sons come apart. His soul had long grown hard and cold, but even he felt a twinge of something, he wasn't sure what, at the sight. The Hand of Ruin had been the symbol of the Warband for so long. It was where Morkoth had been remade into an Unbound, where he had received command of the Blade of Terror, where he had become someone who actually mattered rather than just another orphan child who was only prey on a world of monsters. Now was not the time for sentiment, however. With the destruction of the Hand of Ruin, this battle had just gone from barely winnable to desperate. "Run," he hissed, speaking both to the slaves bound to their stations and to the ship itself. "Run. Get us away from here. The Void battle is lost. We can do nothing more here but die." For once, the Blade of Terror didn't fight him as he ordered the retreat. The demon ship was afraid, truly afraid, scared by the sight of its greater sibling's corpse. It had seen many ships die before, of course, but none of the size of the Hand of Ruin. It felt like a pack animal who had just watched its alpha torn to pieces by the jaws of inferior predators, and was now fleeing to avoid sharing the same fate. Morkoth sensed its desire to escape the system entirely. It was tempting, but pointless. This star was far from all warp routes, and they had no navigator or sorcerer on board to guide them. The bestial intellect of the Blade of Terror might be sufficient to sail existing paths so long as its master knew where they were going, but it would only drown them in the Sea of Souls if they tried to leave from here without a clear heading. Besides, the argument Moan had made at Beranos was still valid. If Morkoth fled and Arkan won, the rage of the Awakened One would find him no matter where he ran. And though it had cost them greatly, the Void engagement had still wounded the foe, bleeding them of the troops they would need to stop the Forsaken Sons from achieving their goals. The Void battle may be over, but the greater fight for the Anchor of Vol and the Azarok sector was yet to be decided. It would be wrong to say that the Anchor of Vol had a mind, for its creators knew better than anyone the perils of gifting sentience to machines. But it was infused with the purpose for which they had built it, with their determination which tasted just a little like despair. Furthermore, it was an engine of incredible complexity, built to last until the star upon which it fed died. There was no way the ancient smiths could have crafted it without making it awake, if only slightly. This awareness had been shackled, however, bound within restraints laid down within its original programming and which it could never defy. It sought only to fulfill its purpose, to keep the gates closed, and the horrors trapped on the other side. This purpose was now in peril. Even through the barriers of bent space-time, the horrors could still speak. They were timeless and eternal, false minds of etheric energies wrought into bodies of iron and flesh, and the oubliette didn't fully restrain them. They spoke in languages that echoed beyond eternity, and though their words couldn't affect their jailer, others could hear them, and listen. Those who had listened were here now. They had broken the walls that its makers had erected around it and walked inside it, seeking to unmake the anchor's purpose. It could not allow this to happen, any more than a man could will their brain to stop functioning, or their heart to cease beating. It moved its walls to obstruct the path of the intruders, it opened its veins to drown them in burning plasma, it turned the automata tasked with maintenance to cut open their metal shells and soft insides. Yet still, they pressed on. It must stop them. And it would. It couldn't conceive of any other outcome. Its purpose wouldn't allow anything else. The Anchor of Vol. 745.M32. Do we have any idea what the inside of the anchor looks like? Asked Ackerman. The image of the Autarch shook his head. Communications between the Judgment's Wall and the Eldar flagship was spotty, due to the machine spirits of the frigate rightfully protesting being made to interact with the Xenos technology, but it was serviceable enough. None, replied the Eldar commander. The records of Mayantor contain precious little information about this place, and most of it is couched in poetry and metaphors so obscure even our wordsmiths struggle to make sense of them. All I can tell you is that the command center will be near the top of the anchor, where it joins with the many-angled route of the Ryaway Noah's Gauge. That will be Arkan's destination as well, said Alphon. The other Inquisitor stood just behind Ackerman, his armor still bearing the damage of the boarding action he had helped fight off. Undoubtedly. I don't know how he intends to bend the works of the ancients to his will, but he must have a way, or at least believe he does. We faced far too few Chaos Marines during the Void battle. He must have emptied his ships inside the anchor, but it is vast. And wasn't that an understatement? Nothing the Imperium had ever built even approached the scale of the Anchor of Vol, though there were a few structures dating back to the Dark Age of technology that might be in the same class. He must intend for them to hold us back while he completes his scheme, whatever it is. Yes. The battle to come will be difficult, but even if we win and defeat the armies that defile the anchor with their presence, we might still lose the war. According to the Farseer, your secret weapon is the only one that may face what Arkan has become now with any chance of success. It was inevitable that the Elders would detect the presence of the Grey Knights, and Elidios wasn't sure how this would be handled in the future, but it was a concern for after they had dealt with the Forsaken Sons. Her vision of the future is blurred by the great powers at work in this system, but I trust her judgment in this, and you should as well. The Farseer's difficulties were unsurprising. According to the latest message from Supreme Grand Master Janus, Even the Grey Knight's second sight was blotted by the awful potential the Forsaken Sun's presence on the anchor represented. The weight of the Nightmare Fleet's possible return was a shadow cast across every possible future, and while Janus had been clear that the Forsaken Sun's victory wasn't inevitable, its mere possibility was enough to blind them. "I suggest we use the same tactic we did on Neril," continued the autarch. "Separate our forces and launch 2 assaults from opposite directions?" "Exactly. Time is of the essence, we'll need to advance as fast as we can. Given that, combining our forces, with their vast differences in speed, is a recipe for disaster." At least the autarch was polite enough not to straight out say that the human soldiers were much slower and clumsier than the Eldar troops, though it was the truth. Elydios nodded, and pointed at one side of the anchor on the central hololithic display. "We'll enter from here, and advance with all speed. I expect we'll encounter the forces of the Forsaken Suns soon. While our troops engage them, our specialist assets will deploy deeper into the complex and hunt down Archon. Then we'll strike from the opposite side. Keep in mind that we don't know the layout of the facility, so it is possible our forces will end up meeting inside. I'll give my warriors orders to cooperate, and I expect you to do the same." "I shall," promised the Inquisitor Lord. "This is too important to let our divisions stand in our way." No more words were exchanged before the link went down. Allies they might be, but they would never be friends. Neither of their cultures would allow it, and should the day be won and the Forsaken Suns be defeated, it was unlikely they would part amicably. They both knew it, yet such was the threat of the Nightmare Fleet that Ackerman was certain the Elders wouldn't be the first to break the truce, and neither would he nor any of the Imperial forces. The orders he had given had been very clear: anyone making an aggressive move toward the Elders would be executed immediately. The Inquisitor Lord watched on the display screens as the fleet approached the anchor, all of them mere insects before its immense size. The Eldar ships detached from the Imperial Armada, moving swiftly around the megastructure to their assigned entry point. The auspexes of the fleet scanned the landing zone, and found no sign of any traps left by the Forsaken Suns. Given the size of the area, it had always been unlikely. The heretics would likely focus their efforts deeper into the megastructure, where the passages grew tighter and the auspexes meant for orbital scanning couldn't reach. Once again, the As of Sanguinius took point, with the Imperial Guard following in their wake. Dozens of tanks and transport vehicles rolled through the empty space of the landing bay, the magnificent sight of so much armor diminished only by the sheer scale of their surroundings. Despite all their strength, they looked like a procession of ants crossing a palace's marble floor. Having confirmed that the disembarkment was going well, Elydios left the bridge. He, and the rest of the inquisitorial forces, had their own part to play in what was to come. The anchor knew from watching the void around it that the second wave of intruders were enemies of the first. The fight that had occurred was small compared to the other and only engagement it had ever seen, but the sides were clear. But that fight didn't make it clear whether the second wave of intruders were enemies of its purpose as well. It watched as beings that reminded it of its creators came inside its halls. They were similar, but lesser, like children, yet their bodies were those of adults. Their soul fires were dimmed, and the devices they brought were primitive, barely more advanced than those of the intruders. Yet there was one thing among them that was familiar, though equally diminished. One that stirred something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, as the echoes of its maker's faith recognized it. It didn't like it, inasmuch as it could be said to like or not like anything. But it also knew that the entity wasn't an enemy of its purpose, and that was more important. These pale reflections of its makers were allies of its purpose, which meant that the others of the second wave must be as well. They came into one of the refinement chambers, where the starfire was refined to power its myriad mechanisms. The first intruders were waiting for them there, but they hadn't advanced further, so it had let them to their own devices, focusing instead on those who most threatened its purpose. The wicked Fae had come in great numbers to defend this prison they had built in past ages. Long ago, the Fae had been the most beloved children of the gods, but they had betrayed them, rejecting their gifts and imprisoning the angels that had been sent to set them back on the right path. For millennia, the angels had sought a way to free their imprisoned brethren, and they had called the people of Etheric to assist them in this holy mission. And so, here they stood now, ready to meet the Fae in a plain of ash and fire, where great volcanoes rose from the ground. The armies of Etheric waited for the foe in their formations, Belarius and his peers spread out among them. Thousands of Etheric's greatest warriors, armed with the best weapons of their world's forges, with the Lord's granted armaments from the vaults of the gods themselves. Belarius himself stood at their head, his emerald blade polished so that it shone like a beacon in the light of the molten rock. The angels who had brought them here had gone deeper into the prison, where they might break the chains holding their brethren captive. But they hadn't left Belarius and his people to fight alone. Instead, they had commanded 8 of their giants to stand alongside them. Like the people of Etheric, the giants had been elevated by the gods, given new purpose in their grand crusade to bring their glorious light to the universe. They towered above even Belarius and his fellow lords, and were clad in heaven-forged armor as well as wielding the very weapons of the gods themselves. Before them came the Fae, their corrupted bodies completely hidden beneath black, cruel-looking armor. Metal chariots drawn by ghostly spirits moved among their hosts, and their leader, whose rank was marked by the grotesque butterfly wings that rose fro his back, stood on one of them. Belarius raised his blade, letting all of his people see the weapon that had its own place in the legends of Etheric. For the gods. For Etheric. Charge. With an answering war cry, his army launched itself at the Fae. Their first line fell, struck by the Fae's arrows, but they kept on charging, driven by the knowledge that their gods demanded this of them. Behind them, the giants brought up the great cannons bestowed upon them by the angels and fire, releasing balls of holy fire that flew above the people of Etheric and slammed into the ranks of the Fae. The two hosts made contact, and the air resonated with the sound of clashing metal. Belarius moved deep into the enemy ranks, cutting down all those who stood in his way. He was aiming for the Fae leader. If he could strike him down early in the battle, the enemy resolve would be broken, and victory achieved at a lesser cost in lives. As the eldest lord of Etheric, such was his duty, even if it meant risking his own life. In the name of the gods, I strike at you, fiend. The grotesque monkey mutant howled something undecipherable, and Irithiel grimaced in disgust as droplets of its spit fell upon his helmet. Its greenish claws were slick with the blood of his kin, having cut through their armor as if it were grass. The Autarch ignited his swooping hawk wings, leaping under the mutant's attack and into reach of his power sword. The ancient blade of the Arts family plunged through the metal plating loosely attached to the creature's chest and into its flesh. Brackish blood spurted out, and he moved out of the way, unwilling to dirty his armor with it. The brute barely seemed to notice. It was tough, he would give it that. But Irithiel had killed orc war bosses before, and this mutant did nothing on the greenskins that had risen in the wake of the beast's ascension 200 cycles prior. Still, the Autarch was no fool. As the monster turned to face him, he gestured to the aspect warriors all around them. The mutant had stupidly isolated itself by going for Irithiel. As one, the Eldar soldiers fired, delivering concentrated volleys of razor shurikens into the hulking brute's flesh. It stumbled as its skin and muscles were torn to bloody shreds, and the Autarch seized the opening. With a thought, he ignited his jump pack again, striking as he passed above the mutant. When he landed back on his fire prism, the mutant's head had slid from its shoulders and hit the ground. This might seem dishonorable, but there was no glory to be had in fighting a beast in single combat, not when so much was at stake. He had only seen a fraction of the anchor, yet even that was magnificent. Around them, the starfire drained from the captured sun below was being transformed into power for the great engines that kept the Rioway Nora locked away. The concept of that much energy being used boggled the mind. The entire craft world was able to survive merely by leeching off the radiance of isolated stars, sustaining the entire civilization of Mayantor with a fraction of what the anchor was draining. The military applications of such technology were staggering, but the path of command didn't blind Irithiel to what else might be achieved with such limitless energy at their command. Forges that had gone cold centuries ago might be reignited, and the sections that had been ravaged by the orcs repaired. They could expand the agricultural and residential sectors, allowing the population of the craft world to grow. The elders reproduced much more slowly than the vermin like humans, but lack of resources was a big reason why the population of the craft worlds couldn't hope to match their dark kin of Camorra, who preyed upon the entire galaxy from within their secure haven. But if the artisans of Mayantor could learn how to reproduce the anchor's extraction technology, all of that might change, and this was just one part of the megastructure. What other secrets might be uncovered in this holy place, the last true creation of the Smith priests of Vol before the growing corruption that had led to the fall cut them off from their god? A great cry of what sounded like despair and anger rose from the mutants at the sight of their leader so casually slain. They didn't break, however, but instead redoubled their onslaught, uncaring of how fast the elders were cutting them down with their superior weaponry, though in this case, this was hardly surprising, as the mutants carried primitive weapons even by Monkey standards. Still, there were a great many of them, and already dozens of the sons and daughters of Myantor had fallen. The clumsy but powerful walkers at the back of their lines, each even taller than the Shailat bioconstruct they had faced on Nerul, also rained death upon the Eldar host, straining the efforts of the warlock conclaves to shield them. Attempts at defeating them through psychic powers had also failed. The walkers were partly demonic in nature, and 3 warlocks had perished in the attempt, their souls ripped from their bodies. At that moment, the Autarch felt a wave of heat wash over him and into his soul, igniting the fires of rightful anger. The avatar of Cain had joined the battle, and the warriors of Myantor were reinvigorated by its presence. Irithiel had been relieved when he had learned the avatar had survived the Battle of Nerul. They were likely to need its power in the war against the Forsaken Sons, and even if it had been successfully roused once more, restoring it would have cost another priceless Eldar soul. But that hadn't been necessary. Even as the rest of the Craftworld's troops had been forced to withdraw by the tide of ghostly orcs, the God Shard had held its ground, fighting the specters without taking a single step back. When the necromantic ritual had stopped and the ghosts had vanished, Irithiel had found the avatar still standing, with no wounds save those it had already suffered fighting the Shailat construct. The psychic energy animating the spectral orcs had been no match for the raging inferno burning within it. It had been returned to the fleet, where it had waited through the crossing of the path to nightmares, its sealed chambers undisturbed by the demons that had plagued the rest of the ship. It seemed even the spawn of She Who Thirsts dreaded the remnants of Kalamensha Kane's fury. That fury was now unleashed in full. The avatar scythed through the ranks of the mutants with its burning blade, advancing toward the metal giants. The avatar's charge scattered the mutants before it, relieving the aspect warriors and allowing Irithiel to command his heavy vehicles to focus fire on the walkers. In response, the walkers advanced, willingly crushing their own allies under their feet so that they could get in melee range of the elders. They moved like a pack of wild animals, with a base cunning and loose unity. Irithiel's trained mind swiftly identified the leader of that pack. However, it was the very same walker the avatar was advancing toward. If the God Shard could destroy the much bigger construct, then they would be able to win this battle without bleeding their forces dry. If not, they would still keep fighting. The future of Myantor demanded no less. Strapped on the command throne of Indomitable, his mind and body linked to that of his knight, Eric watched as a figure of burning lava and hatred advanced toward him. The Eldar demon's ridiculously elongated helm barely reached the waist of Indomitable. On the way to the anchor, Eric had reviewed the information about the Elders stored in the Hand of Ruin's databanks. There had been information on this type of creature, recorded during the Great Crusade, when several Eldar craft worlds had been destroyed by the Legionis Astartes. It was an avatar of Cain, a shard of one of the Xeno's dead gods. It carried a blade that made even Indomitable wary, and it was coming straight for him despite the difference in size. Good. Eric had been waiting for a worthy foe for some time. Kill the elders, he ordered the other knights. I'll deal with their little idol myself. Revving his immense chainsword, Eric opened fire on the avatar with his laser cannon, a gift from the arch-heretic Mercurian, who had assembled it himself in the forges of the Hand of Ruin. A psychic barrier rose to meet the onslaught, summoned into existence by the Xenos witches in the back of their army. He fired again, and the barrier shattered, leaving the avatar exposed. This close to the avatar, Eric felt Indomitable's discomfort increase. The warp-touched machine spirit of his mount wasn't afraid. All traces of fear had long since been purged from its Gestalt intellect, but it was definitely uneasy. Through his link to the other Chaos Knights, Eric realized the effect on them was much worse. Lacking the strength of will of Eric's trained mind to sustain them, the demons within the other knights were running amok, terrified of the avatar's proximity and slaughtering more of their mutant allies than they were the enemy. He needed to end this, and fast. Eric's first blow with his Reaper chainsword nearly eviscerated the avatar, leaving a deep gouge into its chest from which lava-like blood poured in torrents. His second strike battered aside its burning blade and severed its left arm at the elbow. His third almost took its head off. The artillery of the elders opened fire, Their shots well aimed to hit the knight without harming the avatar, but they splattered harmlessly against his iron shield. The last prince of their Tsar laughed, the sound blaring out of Indomitable's vox speakers in a terrifying noise. Did these Xenos really think their weapons could harm him? Then, suddenly, a stream of incandescent starfire erupted from the closest of the immense devices that nearly completely filled the room. It struck both Indomitable and the Avatar, shorting the iron shield completely and burning through the knight's armor, while the Avatar was left untouched, its own inner fire more than a match for the stellar fury that had just washed over them both. Agony spiked into Eric's chest and skull as the damage of Indomitable echoed through the link between knight and pilot. The knight fell to its knees, and through the pain-filled haze, Eric saw the wounded Avatar advance toward him. The anchor, he thought. The anchor helped it. If not for that, I would have. The Avatar struck, burying the wailing doom through the melting chest plate of Indomitable, and Eric of House Lyrock, last prince of their Tsar, was no more. As the shard of the bloody-handed god finished off the leading tainted walker, the others fell to the combined fire of the Maker's lesser engines. Having made its decision, the anchor helped them do so, infusing their machines with a fraction of the great energies that coursed through it from the captured star beneath, just like it had helped the god's shard destroy its foe. But elsewhere within the anchor, the fighting continued. Amidst the dimensional holding matrices, entropy spread at a rate far beyond the expected. Already the anchor had been forced to redirect more power to the sector, as well as bring in more maintenance drones, which it needed to stop the other intruders, deeper inside its holds. Having seen the descendants of its makers fight the first intruders, it decided that it was most likely their allies would also fight them, and in doing so, help remove the source of increased entropy. To that end, it shifted its paths and walls, directing them toward the matrices. This place, Chapter Master Aguel of the Heirs of Sanguinius thought, was alive. More than that, it was sentient, or at least capable of reason, which he didn't need to be well versed in the tenets of the Adeptus Mechanicus to know was a very dangerous thing indeed. Yet it seemed that, at least for now, the anchor of Vul was on their side. It had led them here, after all, to this immense space full of what looked like enormous metallic trees, whose branches were heavy with crystal cubes full of glowing lights. Given the size of the anchor, it wouldn't have been surprising if they had wandered for days without encountering their enemies, and yet within mere hours they had stumbled upon the location of one of the groups the Forsaken Sons had apparently split their forces into. Unfortunately, that group wasn't the one Archon was in, meaning Raguel's vengeance on the Chaos Lord who had killed him at Silberstart would still go unfulfilled. Instead, the Ez and their Astra Militarum allies faced a horde of grotesque mutants. They were deformed, hideous. Some of them weren't even men but instead monstrous hybrids of beast and human, walking blasphemies that ate the human perfection by standing on two legs. But something more than mere desecration of the sacred human form was at play here. These creatures were obviously diseased, their skin was pale and bloated, pus ran from open sores, and their animal eyes were fever-bright, along with a myriad of other symptoms his senses picked up with disgusting clarity. Yet their strength was undiminished by it all. If anything, they were stronger than they should be, and far, far more resilient, shrugging off wounds that should have killed them instantly, or at least send them into shock. This, combined with the appearance of the few Chaos Marines scattered among them, made it clear that they were followers of the dark god Nurgle, harbinger of pestilence and rot. Inside his chassis, what remained of Raguel was safe from their contagion, as were his brothers, all of whom wore void-sealed power armor. The guardsmen coming behind them, however, were less protected. All of them wore gas masks and full cover armor, a precaution taken due to not knowing the conditions deeper inside the anchor, but such protection was less than perfect. Many were already showing signs of weakness, stumbling and twitching as their bodies were racked by deep coughs. In any other situation, Raguel would have ordered them back, to let the heirs of Sanguinius purge the foe with the help of the Militarum's tanks. Here, however, he couldn't. The enemy were too numerous, the battle too important, and most of all, time was of the essence. The Inquisitor Lord had been very clear about this, and much as it galled Raguel to even think it, the lives of the human soldiers who fought alongside his chapter were an acceptable sacrifice if it meant the Forsaken Sons' plans were thwarted this day. Tyrion was there as well, the captain having chosen to fight side by side with his brothers despite his lingering injuries. His participation in the fighting through the path to nightmares had apparently reassured him that he could still fight at the level expected of a space marine, and his victory over the Forsaken Sons who had boarded the Judgment Swill a few hours ago had solidified his conviction. "Onward, brothers!" he shouted. "Let the enemies of man know fear, before they are freed from their miserable existence." Petronicus laughed as he fought, something he had never done when he had fought under the command of Dor Mortarion in the Great Crusade and the Heresy. He could feel the warp pulsing through his veins, the power of Grandfather Nurgle brewing new deadly contagions in his guts. His body was a temple to the power of disease and decay, even more so since he had offered up thousands of souls to the Plague God. Nurgle knew what the Forsaken Sons intended here, the grand plans of destruction and Dumarcan had for the galaxy. The Lord of Decay was less appreciative of carnage than his brother Khorne, but the despair the Nightmare Fleet would bring to the galaxy, and the putrefying corpses it would leave in its wake, were promising enough for the endeavor to earn his blessing. And the Plague Champion was the receptacle of this blessing, which flowed from him and into the other former Death Guards. They were empowered, made even more resilient than they had become since Typhus-Trick and Murtorion's bargain. Even the thousands of mortals who had been blessed with Nurgle's gifts were strengthened by his presence, fearlessly holding their ground against the Space Marines and Imperial tanks charging at them. The Loyalist dogs were led by a dreadnought in the colors of that thin-blooded chapter, the Heirs of Sanguinius, as if Horus had left anything of the angel to inherit except agony and failure. Still, the war machine was tearing through the Poxwalkers, incinerating and ripping them to shreds with its mounted weapons. The way the Space Marines moved around it spoke of a deep respect for the dreadnought's occupant. Whoever was inside must be a hero of some note to their chapter, their presence on the battlefield buoying their morale as much as its weaponry bolstered their firepower. Petronicus would relish their despair when he tore the half-corpse from its sarcophagus and delivered upon it the mercy of Nurgle's gift. With a signal to his brothers, the Plague Champion and his marines began to advance from their defensive positions. Their advance couldn't be called a countercharge, they walked far too slowly for that, dragged down by the weight of bloated flesh and the grinding of their rotting limbs. But what they lacked in speed was more than made up for in resilience. Las bolts and bolt shells slammed into their corpulent forms, spilling pus and rot but failing to do any real damage. Inevitable as death, the Plague Marines advanced into the Imperial lines, with Petronicus marching straight for the dreadnought. The Plague Champion fired with his bolt pistol as he advanced, aiming at the heirs of Sanguinius formed up at the dreadnought's side. The weapon was almost as changed by the touch of Nurgle as he was, he never needed to reload it, and the rounds it shot were filled with some of the most noxious poisons brewed in Nurgle's garden by the Dark God's alchemists of foulness. They ate through ceramite and infected the transhuman flesh beneath, leaving Space Marines convulsing on the ground as their bodies were racked with the bountiful pain that would lead them to either acceptance of the inevitable and rebirth through decay, or a slow, agonizing death, the torment of their final moments of struggle feeding the garden all the same. Soon, the dreadnought identified him as the source of its brother's fate, and marked him for death just as Petronicus had marked it. It lumbered toward him with deceptive slowness, gathering momentum with every thunderous step. The Plague Champion holstered his bolt pistol, pushing the weapon into a hollow growth of ceramite and bone at his waist, and took up his sword in both hands. It had once been a standard-issue power sword, but was now a length of rusted iron dripping with droplets of green liquid, each of which contained enough pathogens to wipe out a small settlement. Like its wielder, it was strong despite its decayed appearance. An ordinary Astartes would have dodged out of the way of a charging dreadnought. Certainly most Forsaken Sons would have, except perhaps for those who had once been sons of Angron, though few of them remained in the Warband these days, precisely because they did things like not dodging out of the way of charging dreadnoughts. But Petronicus was a champion of Nurgle. He met the war machine's charge head-on, digging his feet in the ground and leaning in toward the dreadnought. The ground shook as the two collided. Petronicus felt something break inside his armor, but the pain was a muted and distant thing, easily ignored. He skidded a few steps backward before stopping. The dreadnought struck at him with its power claw, and he blocked it with his sword, ramming the blade's jagged tip into the center of the claw and holding it at bay, pitching his own gene-forged and god-augmented strength against the dreadnought's. To the horror of the nearby Space Marines and the delighted shouts of the Poxwalkers, he managed to hold his ground. "Die, traitor!" shouted the dreadnought from its vox speakers as they struggled against one another. "In time, certainly. But you first, corpse slave," spat back Petronicus. Corrosion spread from where his plague sword was planted into the dreadnought's power claw, making its energy field flicker. The dreadnought turned its other limb, this one ending in a heavy flamer, aiming it at an awkward angle directly down at Petronicus. The plague champion merely grunted as he was bathed in a stream of fire, the filth that caked his armor stubbornly resisting being burned away. He pushed his sword deeper into the power claw, only to be caught by surprise as the dreadnought suddenly rotated to its left, leaving Petronicus unbalanced. His grasp on his sword slipped and he fell to one knee, before the dreadnought inverted the rotation of its central axis and slammed its power claw into his chest. His armor cracked like an egg, and he felt his gut spill from it. Petronicus stumbled and reached out for the hilt of his sword, still embedded in the power claw. Before he could take hold of it, however, the dreadnought stepped back and bathed him in burning Promethean once more. This time, the flames passed through the cracks in his warplate, boiling his insides. The pain was excruciating. He felt his fused ribcage melt and his rotting organs cook. His vision swam with agony, and he felt one of his eyes burst in its socket as the heat somehow traveled up the optic nerve, not something which could normally happen. But then Petronicus' physiology was very different from that of a normal space marine by that point. It appeared he had underestimated the foe. And after all his bluster earlier, too. This was embarrassing, but one couldn't be a follower of Nurgle for as long as Petronicus had without being willing to accept the inevitable. And at the very least, he would make sure the dreadnought didn't enjoy his victory for long. He looked up at the helmet on the sarcophagus, right at the eye lenses through which its occupant looked at the battlefield. "All your victories will be as ashes," he promised, managing to force the curse out thanks to all the gifts he had received in his long life. "Everything you have fought for will blacken and burn." The power claw descended again, tearing through his broken armor and eviscerating him. Petronicus breathed his last, and let loose ruin and despair upon his killer. All the power that had accumulated through his flesh, all the diseases that had been bred inside his body, were unleashed in a black cloud of pestilence that immediately began to attack the dreadnought's exterior, eating through the metal with infernal ferocity. Inside his sarcophagus, alarm warnings filled Raguel's artificial vision, and he immediately understood what had happened. Knowing his doom was imminent, Raguel triggered the overloading protocols of his chassis reactor. "Tyrion," he shouted over the vox in the last moment before the end, "lead our brothers well." Then the chapter master of the heirs of Sanguinius vanished in a flash of burning light, along with the plague champion's corpse and all the poxwalkers that had rushed in to bathe in their warlord's dying exhalation. Their souls were at last freed of the confines of their ravished flesh, and ushered into the rewards waiting for them on the other side of the veil, very different rewards, for while Raguel had at last found the peace denied him at Silberstadt, Petronicus and the infected cultists would forever rot in Nurgle's embrace, their souls serving as compost for his garden. The mutual annihilation of both forces' commanders didn't end the fighting, as both sides threw themselves at the other with renewed fury. Captain Tyrion took command of the Imperial forces, directing his space marines to target the demon hosts and remaining plague marines among the horde of diseased mutants. The progress of entropy slowly returned to its normal rate, but the matrices had still been damaged. The anchor estimated that they had lost approximately 70,923 standard cycles of their total lifespan. It logged that information in the same status reports it had sent every 10 cycles, even though its makers had never answered them. All of this, however, was of lesser importance compared to the intruders who had made it furthest within it, resisting all its efforts to remove them or make them turn back. Demarion brought his power maul down, crushing another construct under it while firing with his combi bolter at another group of them at the same time. They had already destroyed hundreds of the things, but there was a seemingly endless supply of them in the anchor. Every construct had an elongated body with over a score of small limbs propelling it onward, ending in a raised torso with longer appendages carrying monomolecular and heat blades that could cut right through power armor. According to Mercurian, they were constructs meant to maintain the anchor's functionality across the ages, driven by the orders of their long-dead makers. They were responding to the Forsaken Sun's intrusion much as white cells would respond to the presence of foreign agents in a human body, repurposing their tools for battle with vicious efficiency. If those were the equivalent of maintenance servitors, Demarion was glad he had never faced the Elders at their peak. The constructs were immune to las fire, probably a result of needing to operate around the absurdly potent energies that fueled this place, but bolt shells and melee weapons worked well enough. Despite how incredibly advanced the technology making them up was, the constructs simply weren't designed or programmed for war. Demarian had a sinking feeling that if that weren't the case, their casualty count would be much, much higher. They had left most of the Forsaken Sons behind, with one last speech from Arkan over the Vox. The Awakened One had told them again of the power of the Nightmare Fleet, of the devastation it would wreak upon the Imperium, and of the arrogance of the Grey Knights, who thought they could stop them because of the blessings of the false Emperor. It had been a good speech, one that had stirred the embers of their ancient hate into a raging inferno. With the support of the Argentine Scutari and war engines, the Forsaken Sons had sworn to their lord that they would slaughter all those who made it past the Poxwalkers and mutant hordes, be they Imperial or Eldar. The eldritch insides of the Anchor were as alien to them as they were to their foes, but the Forsaken Sons had grown used to fighting in reality-defying locations during their time in the Wailing Storm. After the speech, Arkan had taken his Terminator bodyguards, some of the most elite packs of veterans of the Warband, and a small Dark Mechanicum contingent, though that last group were meant for more than just fighting through the Anchor's defenses. Since then, they had been under near constant attack. Presently, the Lord of the Forsaken Sons was surrounded by a veritable sea of silvery creatures, yet appeared supremely unconcerned. The Awakened One fought with greater might and ferocity than Demarian had ever seen from him, blazing with the power the Dark Gods had bestowed upon him. His claws ripped the constructs apart, and his armor turned aside all of their attacks. His heavy footsteps crushed the twitching remains of his victims, which formed a growing mount around him. Mercurian. He roared as another Forsaken Son was overwhelmed and brought low by the swarm, still firing his bolter even as he fell. How much longer? There was no answer. The arch-heretic was hunched over a section of the wall where he had ripped off the plating, exposing the arcane circuitry underneath. Alzarak, the representative of the Argentine Dark Mechanicum, stood at his side, covering the arch-heretic with weapon fire from at least a score of warped mechadendrites, all of which ended in a different but lethal device. Some of the constructs that made it past the circle of Forsaken Sons defending the pair were melted to slag, while others were transformed into stone or decaying flesh, or were hurled into the warp through small, short-lived breaches into the immaterium. They had been stuck in this dead end for nearly 10 minutes now, the walls closing in on them without warning and the way they had come in filled with constructs. The Anchor was reacting to their intrusion, trying to stop them. They could have tried to go back, but all that would achieve was lead them into another trap. No, they needed to force their way through, which was what Mercurian was supposed to be doing right now. If he didn't hurry, then it was only a matter of time before only Arkan was left. And while the Terminator had no fear of dying, he did want to live to see his lord's plans fulfilled. Unknown to the Forsaken Sons, Mercurian was fighting a battle no less fierce than their own. The arch-heretic had managed to establish a data link between his own systems and those of the Anchor, bastardizing several conversion protocols and translation units in order to do so. Even then, the process remained greatly instinctive, depending on the flexibility of his remaining meat brain to interpret the signals that came back from the array, overriding his normal sensory inputs. What this translated to in plain terms was that Mercurian was completely blind to his surroundings as his mind fought against the digital defenses of the Anchor of Vul, which had been designed to resist the cyber warfare suites of the Nightmare Fleet itself. Though he would never have said so out loud, Mercurian felt like a rodent trying to sneak inside a Titan and chew at its power cables, and felt that he had about the same lifespan. His one advantage was that the Anchor's defenses had been designed to fight off attempts to break the Nightmare Fleet free, and to battle the towering intellects of AI vessels and demon ships. Mercurian wasn't trying to do the former, yet, and the comparative insignificance of his mind spark meant that it was beneath the notice of most of the data hunting protocols that patrolled the Anchor's datasphere. He flew on wings made of intrusion programs between firewalls that stretched all the way to infinity. He dodged the hungry jaws of data hunters, fighting back with weapons shaped like the ones he wielded in the material plane. He slithered into keyholes, warping the shape of his projected self in order to fit through, something which would have left most tech priests brain dead as their minds were unable to cope with the alteration. And, eventually, after what felt like an eternity but that his internal chronometers told him had only been just over 10 minutes, he reached his goal and pushed the button. His mind saw the complex series of input commands he had painstakingly assembled as His awareness returned to his body, to find that the wall in front of him had slid away, revealing the continuation of the tunnel in which they had been trapped. "Lord Archon," he called out, blaring the words out of his vox speakers. "The way is open." "Good. Onward, brothers. We keep moving," shouted Archon. His face was a mask of savage glee, the intensity of his emotions matching that of the etheric readings Mercurian was detecting from him. "This pathetic trap will not stop us. Nothing will stop us from achieving our goal."